The young lady hoped that she would one day be able to gain recognition from her family and stand on equal terms with them. The man looked at the young lady intently and asked if she admitted her mistake. Psyche froze in place. Logan Silkesia, the head of the family, looked at the young lady intently and said that he would not say much. Logan said that knowing her past, he was glad that she decided to end her life, so he threw poison at her feet. The young lady looked at her father and said that he was too cruel, and also asked for mercy for Psyche's. Lily looked at her father with a pitiful look. She hoped that he would listen to hers. Izara looked at Lily and said that this was too much since she almost died because of Psyche. Lennox shouted that everything was right and no one would be upset if she died. Psyche, in turn, looked at them with a sad smile. She knew that she was just a substitute and a false princess. For 10 years, the young lady lived in the shadows, even if she was just a substitute. She was very happy to be accepted into the family, and to bear the name of the fake lady. She wanted to help the family with all her might, so as not to disappoint them. She screamed that she didn't do it. She swore that she didn't know anything. She screamed that they could ask the maids, because it really wasn't her fault she froze, because water poured on her. Lennox shouted furiously that the investigation was already over, and a decision had already been made. Izara said that everything was already over, but they found something. He looked at the young lady and said that the necklace was found in her room. He looked at the young lady, intently picked up the necklace, and said that the maid was there, and confirmed the young lady froze in place. He said that if you put this pendant on, poisonous needles will come out of it. He asked if she wanted to give it to Lily. Psyche did not know what was happening, since her servant was actually serving Lily. Lily rushed to her father. With tears, she told the young lady that she thought they were real sisters. The young lady, in turn, saw that her so-called family looked at her with disdain. She knew that from the beginning, she had no place in the family. She knew that she was just a target for the rest of the family. She knew that if she had a chance at a new life, she would never live like this. The young lady woke up and looked around the room in surprise. She looked at the maid and called her, asking what she was doing. The maid was puzzled and said that she was cleaning. A moment later, the young lady took the knife in her hands and felt a flow of mana. She was surprised because she realized that she had mana. She wondered if this was a dream. At the same time, the maid was cleaning the room. She was very angry and did not understand how a lady could live with such dirt. Look! She remembered what her so-called family said, that the maid confirmed everything. She angrily threw a knife at her. The lady wondered for a moment whether this was a dream or reality, as she had a strange feeling. The maid, puzzled, said that it was very painful for her. Psyche, asking for forgiveness, said that she just wanted to help with the cleaning. The young lady picked up a knife and cut her finger. She felt pain and realized that this was not a dream. A swordsman hero and imperial knight. Izar's eldest son had great talent and could become a great swordsman. The second son, Lennox, is not as good as the eldest son, but is very smart for his age. The young lady sighed heavily, for she knew that she had been brought into the house to be a substitute. The eldest daughter, Psyche, is a useless imposter lady who only looks like the real thing. She was just a substitute for the real missing lady. So when she came into the family, she wanted to be useful, but the brothers did not want to acknowledge her. The man looked at her intently and told her to know that she was his daughter, just like the other children. She knew that this made her brothers very angry, because her older brother could not beat her in fencing, and the younger one never liked to study, because she had to teach him. The man looked closely at the young lady and said that she was doing very well. The young lady, in turn, thought that she would be recognized, but the only thing she got was a shameful death. She thought about it because she knew she was just being stupid. But it didn't matter. Now she remembered the legend that had been passed down from generation to generation. The god of fate who favored people gave one chance to improve those who deserved it. She realized that he blessed the fake on that very day. A moment later, a maid burst into the room and shouted at the young lady. Psyche looked at the maid in bewilderment, as she did not understand why she was so worried. The maid looked at the young lady intently and asked with a smile if she had heard that Lily had returned. Psyche, together with the maid, slowly descended down to the family. Lennox hugged his sister with tears in his eyes. He was very happy to see her. The young people were surprised. They didn't even know how many years they hadn't seen her. They wanted to know if it was really her. The priest looked at them and said with a smile that Duke Vicente had helped them, and he immediately prepared to save the lady. The priest said that as a confirmation that it was her, they conducted a test that completely matched the missing lady. He looked at everyone closely and said with a smile that the young lady was the real Lily Cecilia, and the temple would fully guarantee the test. The maid rushed to the young lady and asked with a smile if she remembered her, while another maid asked her friend, "How was Mrs. Psyche?" Melissa turned around with a smirk and looked at the young lady as she had forgotten about her. Psyche came closer to the young lady and called her by name. Lennox looked at Psyche with fury and asked what she was doing now. Psyche looked at the lady and greeted her. She said that she was inconvenienced, but her room would be ready in a few days. Psyche looked at the lady intently and said that it would be very bad if Lily thought that she had stolen something from her. Lennox asked what all this was about. The lady said that she was simply returning to Lily everything that was rightfully hers. He shouted that if she continued to behave like this, he would throw her out. Psyche looked at her brother and said that he could do whatever he wanted. The young man looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Psyche looked at the lady and said that while her family was looking for her, they had appointed her as her maid, so she was now returning her. Psyche looked at the maid and called her, and told her that she must continue to serve Lily. Lennox looked at the lady with puzzlement and asked angrily where she was going now. The young lady in turn knew that everything was happening just as it had been. Opening the door, the young lady saw her brother. She was a little surprised, but still invited him into the room. He looked into my room and saw the suitcase. He asked if it was true that she had decided to move. Psyche knew that if he were her real brother, he would be worried about her insincerely. And not like now, she said that she just wanted to return the room to its owner. He looked at her and told her that, in that case, she should move into the room on the second floor, and he would tell her father about it. The young lady looked at her brother closely and agreed. She knew that the second floor was a guest room. She sighed heavily because she knew that it didn't matter to her where she would live. The young lady in turn understood that she needed to get out of the house as soon as possible. The young lady was puzzled because she woke up with a severe headache. The maid came to the young lady and casually placed the cup on the table. She said that Izar asked her to pass the tea so that she could enjoy it to the fullest. The young lady in turn knew that her brother sent her tea every day that would help her relieve her headache, but unfortunately, her head hurt even more. Lily looked at the maid and said that if it weren't for the Duke, she would still be living with the tribe. The young lady wondered why her past life was so hopeless. She was taken aback, as she knew she had to hurry to get ready in time. She knew that she no longer had a maid, so she had to get ready herself. She sighed heavily, knowing that the fake princess was now an empty space in the family. The young lady slowly chose an outfit for herself. She liked it the most. She knew that it was time for her to go out into society. Izar told his companion that the northern monsters were very fierce, but to move forward, he needed the emperor's support. The Duke asked him if he really thought he couldn't convince the emperor, and Izar asked why the emperor would support him. Izra showed the Duke that he couldn't see him off now. As he had too busy a schedule, the Duke of Fury shouted at his friend to stop. The Duke in turn wondered whether the young man would behave like this for the rest of his life. The young lady saw the Duke and came closer to him. Brandia Restur looked at the young lady with a smile and said that they had not seen each other for a long time, and also asked how her work was. The Duke is the owner of the Violet Flame. She remembered that during her death, she saw violet sparks and wondered if he was there. Then also, the Duke was her fiancé. Psyche looked at the Duke and said that he would have a lot of problems because of the northern monsters. The Duke sighed heavily and said that she shouldn't worry about it. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and said that she could help him with this. About a year ago, intelligent monsters began to appear in the duchy, living in the dungeons nearby. The Duke gathered troops to destroy them, but the people fell faster than the monsters. Because of this incident, the Duke asked the Emperor for help, but the Emperor did not offer any help. In return, he decided to betroth the Duke to a lady from the Silkisia family, for which reason their engagement was forced. The young lady, without realizing it, fell in love with him, but they were just playing for the public. There was no close connection between them. Therefore, if their marriage is dissolved, she and he will be kicked out of the family, and because of this, it will become even more painful for her. The Duke looked at her and said that if she just wanted to spend time with him, he apologized in advance, as he was tired from the journey. The young lady looked at him and said that she knew the names of the leaders of the monsters that lived in the north. The Duke said he had no idea how she had learned about them, but it was none of her business. The young lady said that she would tell him about the monsters' weaknesses, and they would be able to defeat them. The young lady timidly said that in return, he would give her a promise. The Duke asked in surprise what she wanted. She said that the reason for their engagement was monsters. He asked if she really wanted to save their marriage, even if they disappeared. She looked at him and said that it was not so. Since she wanted to break up right away, Psyche asked him to break off their engagement as soon as the monsters disappeared. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was serious. The young lady said that everything was exactly like that, and she wanted freedom. She said that she simply wanted to take off this burdensome ring. And that was all, since she knew that the Duke did not like their marriage. These rings are a family heirloom. They shared the emotions of the owners, and also determined their location. Unfortunately, there are restrictions on the rings. She knew that it wouldn't be easy to take them off. Emotional exchange didn't really work, and the location was difficult to determine. The Duke looked at her intently and said that he would not take it off for now. She said that she knew that if she took it off now, she would immediately disappear from His Majesty's sight. Psyche said that after the monsters were gone, she wanted him to take it off her. The Duke asked in surprise what was in her favor. He said that a deal is made when both parties win. She said that taking off the ring was in itself an advantage for her. The Duke said that he did not understand anything. The young lady looked at him intently and said that it didn't matter, that he didn't understand. If he was willing, she would like to make a deal. The Duke slowly returned to his estate and thought about this situation. The man looked at the gentleman intently and said that he thought the request had failed. The Duke asked his assistant what would be the advantage to the young lady if she took off her ring, and the assistant asked if that was possible. The assistant said that since the princess was the Duke's fiancée, there were some advantages. The Duke was puzzled and did not understand why she asked to take off the ring. The assistant looked at the gentleman in surprise. The Duke suddenly remembered her look when they finally made the deal. The Duke, for his part, knew that he had no need to think about such things. He knew he was still getting married because of the monsters. The Duke looked at his assistant and told him to move the raven to the princess, and the young lady knew that the monsters of the north were unusually vulnerable to the cold, so it was logical to attack them with fire. But there were also those monsters that only became stronger from fire, as if the monsters from the south had moved to the north. The young lady knew that a magic sword was needed to destroy the monsters, but she couldn't remember the name of the stone when suddenly someone doused her with cold water. The maids looked at the young lady in mock surprise and said they were very sorry, as they did not know she was there. They looked at the young lady with disdain and said that they did not know that such a noble lady would walk in such a place. The maid looked at her friend and asked, puzzled, if she would really be fired because of this. The other maid said that everything was fine, since the lady was just a fake, who would soon be thrown out. The young lady ran into her room in a hurry. She was shocked by this incident. She fell to the ground and trembled. Psyche knew that no one should know about her curse. The young lady knew that she must not show any signs of it and stand firm. The bullying from the servants lasted for several days, but because she ignored them, they stopped bothering her. She endured it for the sake of the moonstone. She knew that it was enough to coat the weapon with moon powder, and it would pierce the monster's skin. She knew that there was still the problem of the regeneration of magical monsters. She knew that the magical monsters had to be eliminated first. A moment later, someone knocked on her door, and she walked out and saw her family. Lily smiled and greeted the young lady. Psyche looked at the guests in surprise and asked what they had come for. Lily smiled and said that she came to her to ask her about something. The young lady looked at her surprised. Lily smiled and said that she was not raised as a lady, so she would like to take a few lessons from her. Lilia said that she had been replacing her for a long time, and she did not want to disgrace herself in high society. Lennox looked at the lady and said that she must help Lily since she was taking her place, and she must do it properly. Psyche said that she did nothing special as a lady. Whenever she went out in public, she always became a laughingstock, so she locked herself in her room, reading books and practicing fencing. Lennox looked at her with disdain and said that this was to be expected, since she was not an aristocrat. He looked at his sister and said that it was time for them to go, as they were simply wasting their time. She did nothing like a lady, and it must be thanks to her that they became outstanding brothers, she wanted them to leave as soon as possible. Lily said that she wanted to ask the young lady something. Lily looked at her and asked with a smile who Duke Restier was, since all the people said that he would soon be engaged to her. She said that there were rumors that he was a little scary. Psyche was puzzled and did not know what to answer. Lily wanted to know if an engagement between nobles could take place at a distance. Lennox said that sister was just clarifying. Psyche said she might get through it. The young lady was shocked to hear such information. She said that it was simply terrible. Lily asked the young lady if she could meet the Duke in her place next time. Psyche, in turn, wanted to conclude a contract with the Duke at their next meeting. She did not know what to do in this situation. Lily said that she wanted to meet the Duke because she was his future bride. Psyche asked if she could ask the Duke about it, since his wishes had to be taken into account. Lily said that she understood everything. Lily said, looking at the young lady, that she was doing all this for the sake of the family. Psyche, in turn, felt very bad. The young lady was shocked as she felt her body being covered in ice. Lily looked at the young lady in surprise and called her. Psyche was in shock because she felt pain and suffered greatly. Lennox looked at his sister and told her not to worry the way Psyche did to get attention. Lennox said that she had tried to pity him in this way many times before the maid knew that she no longer served the lady and she should not approach her. The young lady, in turn, sat in the corridor and breathed heavily. She was in great pain. When Psyche woke up, she saw tea and a letter on the table. She was puzzled because she had a headache. The young lady walked slowly and cut the tea into flowers. She didn't want to receive anything more from her family. A moment later, she opened the letter and saw an invitation to a banquet in honor of the second prince's birthday. In her past life, she prepared a dress for a banquet, but she was never able to go on the day of the banquet. Someone tore her dress. She guessed that Lilia might have given the order to the maid to do something like this. This time, she didn't want to go to the banquet of her own free will. Izara looked closely at the young lady and asked in surprise where she was going to go. The young lady, in turn, knew that, as long as it did not harm the family, her brother did not worry about hers, but she didn't think that he would be so angry with her because of this. The young lady looked at him intently and said that she had to go somewhere. The young man said that he had ordered the tailor to make a dress for her for the banquet. He asked if the butler had not informed her about this. She looked at him intently and said that unfortunately, she had not heard about it. Izra said that he would go with her, since they needed to talk. Lily said that she was not feeling well yesterday, and now she would like to go for a walk together. The young lady, in turn, looked at them intently. She knew that she was nothing more than a political puppet to them. Psyche thanked her relatives and said that she did not need the dress at all. She said that she thought they were very busy, so they did not need to accompany her. The young lady, in turn, saw her brother's arrogant look, which said that if she dared to disobey, she would be in big trouble. He looked at her and said that when she finished her business, she needed to go to the boutique Madame. The young lady nodded in agreement, but in turn, she did not want to go there at all. She knew that no matter what it took, they would never follow her. Walking around the city, the young lady sighed heavily because she was tired. In the end, she couldn't find the moonstone anywhere. She tried to find an alternative way to use freezing magic. Unfortunately, she didn't succeed. She thought whether she should go to a jewelry store and check the authenticity of the moonstone. A moment later, she heard someone's voice and was taken aback because the voice was familiar to her. Turning around, she saw the Marquis's daughter, Hilvia Esland. She was the main culprit of Psyche's incessant persecution. A moment later, Psyche saw the young lady's gang. They looked closely at the young lady and wondered why she was walking around alone while her family was in the boutique. Psyche looked at the young ladies intently, but said nothing. Hilvia was shocked as the young lady turned around and walked away from them, asking angrily if she was ignoring them. Hilvia asked her if the Duke was breaking off their engagement. Because she was so rude, Psyche was shocked. Hilvia said with a grin that it seemed the lady didn't know that there were rumors that the Duke had a new bride. She said that it was not even surprising, because the lady was just a fake Psyche, in turn knew that she would say so. Hilvia looked at her closely and asked what was wrong. She said that if the Duke and the princess get engaged, who will throw her out? A moment later, the young lady was taken aback, as someone put an arm around her shoulders. The Duke looked hard at the young lady and asked to whom he was engaged. The young ladies looked at the Duke in surprise, as they did not expect to see him. They were very frightened. The Duke told the young lady that he thought she was not feeling well and decided to postpone the communication of this news. The Duke looked at them intently and told them to tell him a very interesting story as well. The young lady was taken aback and said that she had not intended to convince him at all. But nevertheless, the Duke was engaged to Princess Lily. The young ladies looked at the Duke intently and said that rumors had already spread throughout the empire. Psyche knew that if they became engaged, their joint engagement would be considered invalid. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and gently touched her face. Psyche froze in place. The Duke smiled a radiant smile and said that there would be no marriage between he, won't be Lily either. Psyche looked at the Duke in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The lovely ladies looked closely at the young men. They were shocked and said that it seemed like the rumors were false. The Duke, in turn, was a little disappointed, as the reaction of the lovely ladies immediately changed. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that it was time for them to go. The young lady, in turn, agreed with the Duke, and they walked slowly. The lovely ladies, in turn, watched them with angrily and did not forget to discuss them. Some time later, the young lady and her companion were sitting drinking tea, and the Duke asked her if she still wanted to dissolve their marriage. The young lady approached, looked at him, and said that she wanted to end the marriage. The Duke thought about it, as it seemed to him that she had become a different person. He looked at her, asked if it didn't look like the cat had been stalking him, then suddenly took offense and went away. He remembered their meeting and how she said she wanted to take off the ring. The Duke knew very well about the properties of the ring. He knew that sharing emotions is possible when partners have mutual sympathy. He wondered if something had happened, as he could previously feel the young lady's sadness and sorrow. But now something had changed. The young lady asked the Duke directly if he had a relationship with Lily. The Duke firmly replied that this was not the case at all. The young lady sighed heavily and said that they would still have to make a contract to destroy the monsters. She looked at him and asked when they could make a deal. The Duke said they could write the contract now. Some time later, they wrote a contract. The Duke said that the content of the contract was simple, and if she agreed, she could sign. Psyche reread the contract again and slowly signed it. The Duke was very concerned about her request and asked the young lady how long she had been training in fencing. Psyche was surprised by such questions and did not wonder whether he had seen her hand. She knew that since she had decided to leave her family, there was no point in hiding anything now without looking at the Duke. Psyche said that she had been doing this for about 10 years. He thought she had grown up like a lady, but with those wounds, it seemed like she had never let go of her sword. Now he realized that all the rumors were lies. The young lady said that she had already signed the contract and asked the Duke to do the same. She looked at him sharply and said that they were finished, and if he had nothing more to say, she would not mind leaving. The Duke looked at her intently and said that he did not intend to detain her. A moment later, the young lady heard someone's voice and turned around to see her family. The young people looked at Psyche in surprise, as they did not expect to see her with the Duke. The Duke looked at them with fury and said that they were very lucky to have met them all. Lily, in turn, ran up to the Duke with lightning speed. She looked at him intently and said that she really wanted to see him, but next time she would like to see him differently. Psyche promised to talk to the Duke, but she did not say that she would sit with them. Lily smiled, looking at the Duke, and with a smile said that she was very glad to see him, and also introduced herself. Psyche saw that the young lady behaved completely differently from her, but this did not surprise her, since Lily did not know the rules of etiquette at all. Psyche knew that Lelia was good at showing her sweet side, and no one could fall in love with such a girl. The Duke looked at her intently and said that he understood everything, and also asked her to make way for him. The Duke's assistant apologized to the young lady and said that the Duke had a very busy schedule. The young lady, in turn, looked at her brothers with tears in her eyes, as she did not think that she would be rejected. Lennox told his sister not to cry, because the Duke was always rude and she shouldn't pay attention to such things. Izara was puzzled and did not understand what it was like, as he knew that the Duke did not like Psyche at all. He knew that the Duke was either putting on a show that he was doing well or that he had truly fallen in love with her. He was puzzled because it was completely incomprehensible to him. He looked closely at the young lady and asked if they were just sitting with the Duke. Izara said that she forbade the use of the castle for gatherings, and she would live without a maid for 1 week. The young lady, in turn, said that she had no objections. She remembered how, in her past life, she had asked her brother for forgiveness, with tears in her eyes, and said that she was very sorry. He looked at her and said that she was not thinking about anything at all, and also forbade her to go to fencing lessons. She knew that fencing was the only thing she could do at home. She had tolerated her family, but taking away her favorite activity was too much. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he made such a decision. He said that the place where they practice fencing belongs to his family, and only family members can use it. She said that soldiers who do not belong to the family still contribute to the family, and she contributes too. The young people looked at her in surprise, as they did not expect to hear something like this. Izura remembered that his father had told him to make her think that she was worthless, so that they could trample her pride and make her cling to the house. Izara asked the lady if she was a member of the family or a soldier. She looked at them and said that she would not live by their rules, because she chooses what she does. The young men froze in shock, as they did not expect to hear something like that from her. Izara asked if she understood what she was talking about. He said that when the father is not at home, then his will is the will of the father. He asked if she was really going to contradict him. Psyche asked if she had ever broken the rules or disobeyed him. She remembered how everyone was whispering and saying that she was a fake. She asked if he knew how he felt about her. Lennox asked furiously when she had become so bold. Izara, was I growing up, as I saw the intent glances of passers-by. Lily looked at her brother and asked him to calm down. Izara told him to sit down and calm down. Lennox wanted to object, but his brother said that he was also on probation. He looked at the young lady and said that he would come to her later, and they would discuss the matter. She said that she would like to finish here and now. She said she would compete with the private soldiers he had assigned to serve and prove her importance to the family. Isolette looked at the Duke and said that he definitely liked that lady. He also asked the Duke if he had not said that women warriors were against them. Isolette asked the Duke if he would like to spar with her, since she had been practicing fencing for so long. The Duke asked in surprise if he really thought the lady was such a master of the ball. The young man said that he just decided to clarify. He did not understand why the Duke suddenly became so serious. The Duke said that the lady had decided to change her strategy and was thus trying to attract his attention. Isolette looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if the lady had fallen in love with him. The Duke asked if a man in love could propose a divorce. He told the Duke that it seemed she wanted to kindle a fire in him. The Duke knew that, according to surveillance, she had even changed her usual rhythm of life. He did not know why. Isolette looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if this was really treason. The Duke said angrily that now was not the time to discuss this here, and also asked if the carriage had arrived. A moment later, the Duke entered the carriage and was enveloped in a fierce smoke. He looked at his master and told him to drink the medicine quickly. The Duke sighed heavily as he felt a little better after taking the medicine. Isolette looked at the gentleman and asked if Lilia had any abilities. He refused, saying that they should have a blessing that would be passed down from generation to generation, and for this reason, the Emperor arranged their engagement. The Duke said that this was certainly not the reason for the engagement, since everything was done because of the duchy. The young man told the Duke that he should improve his health instead. The Duke said that they needed to stop by and buy some medicine. At the Magic Association, the young lady looked at the Duke and said that Lona was absent, so he would not be able to meet her. The Duke asked if it was possible to make an appointment as early as possible. The girl said that she would certainly look up the date and appointment. The Duke asked in surprise what appointment was being discussed. The girl said that she was speaking about a consultation regarding the duchy on behalf of Psyche Silkesia. The girl was taken aback, as she shouldn't have said this since the information is confidential. The girl, puzzled, asked the Duke for forgiveness, since he should not have listened to this. The Duke thought for a moment and wondered if she had begun to explore the northern lands. He knew that using ice magic against monsters was a well-known mystery. In most cases, the monster was strong against cold. The Duke wondered if the young lady didn't know how to destroy the monsters, or if she wanted to save the marriage. The Duke looked at the assistant and said that he had to meet with the young lady and asked what his schedule was. The young lady slowly got ready. She was very happy, as she had not had a sparring match for a long time. She remembered that her last sparring session was a year ago, when her brother invited her to train together. She knew that it was very difficult for her then, because it was as easy as pie to defeat him. But the young lady in turn did not want to do this, because then her brother became very angry. Then he said that it was not proper for a noble lady to hold a sword, so she stopped training with it. A moment later, she saw that they had brought her tea again every day she poured it out. A moment later, the young lady froze in place as she saw that the flowers she had poured tea into had spoiled. The young lady came to the training ground and could tell from the atmosphere that her brother had already been pestering them. She knew that her brother didn't know what real talent she had, so he wasn't too worried. He looked at everyone intently and said that everyone was gathered here and knew why, because Psyche wanted to fight them. They all looked at her mockingly and asked, what would happen if the young lady got hurt? No one wanted to spar with her. But a moment later, one of the knights said that he wanted to fight her. Bowing, the young man said that he was looking forward to their duel. The young lady in turn looked at him intently, for she knew that he was an aristocrat. Moments later, she smiled and said that she wished him luck too. The young lady in turn knew that now she simply needed to show off her fencing skills. It's been 3 years since she fought Aiden. She saw that the number of soldiers training had noticeably increased. The young man looked closely at the young lady and said that she could go first. Psyche, looking at the young man, said that she would not give in. She knew that they all thought that she was weak. She wanted to finish him off with one blow, and then no one would have any doubts about her. She knew that, unlike sparring with her brother here, she couldn't restrain herself. The young lady hoped that she would be able to have fun to the fullest. The young men looked intently at the knight. They did not understand why he was standing like a pillar. They were shocked because the young lady was very fast. The young lady looked intently at the young man as he kept his eyes fixed on her. He smiled looking at her and asked if he could help her with anything. She said that everything was fine, and she didn't need help. She looked closely at the young man. She knew that his skills were good, and he was a good person too. Aiden looked at the young lady and asked if she really wanted to become a knight. Looking at him, she said that she was going to become an outstanding knight. She knew that if she became a knight, then regardless of the will of the family, she could serve the empire. She looked at him intently, as she did not understand why he was sitting here if he was so talented. There were 2 types of imperial knights. Ikasha is the place where Izura, the deputy captain, is completely controlled by the family. In addition, their family was in conflict with the crown prince, so he had his own knights serving the empire. She knew that all she wanted now was to leave her family. She knew that even if her family ignored her, she decided to live for herself and be recognized by high society. She knew that simply running away from her family was not the solution. The young man looked at the young lady intently as he wanted to tell her something. A moment later, a maid came up to them and called out to the young lady that the Duke had arrived to see her. Aiden looked at the young lady with a puzzled expression and said that he would finish the conversation later. The maid looked at the lady in surprise and asked where she was going after training. She told the lady that she needed to take a bath. Psyche completely forgot about etiquette, but in turn wondered why the maid continued to help her. She looked at the maid and asked if she had finished her work. The maid said that she had taken care of everything and that the young lady needed to get dressed in order to go out to the Duke. Psyche said that she was ready and would go, since she knew that she had kept the Duke waiting. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she didn't want to change her outfit. The lady said that there was no need for that. A moment later, they were walking slowly towards the Duke. The young lady glanced sideways at the maid and asked about the tea she brought every morning. The maid said that no one had given the order to bring tea today, but if Psyche wanted it, she would bring it. Psyche, in turn, realized that her brother had decided to stop giving her tea, but she still told the maid to bring her tea. While talking to the maid, she did not see Lily and accidentally ran into her in the corridor. The maid looked at Lady Lily in surprise, as she was very angry. Psyche looked at the young lady in surprise, as she saw that she was trembling with anger. The young lady entered the room and apologized for being late, and also asked the Duke how long he had been waiting for her. The Duke looked at her intently and said that Lady Lily had been here some time ago. Now the young lady understood why the maid was dragging her feet. The Duke said he heard that the lady wanted to arrange a meeting with him. The lady said that this was not entirely true, although there had been a time when Lady Lily had asked her to make an appointment with them. She said that she didn't know that he would come to the estate today, as he came unannounced. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and said that he would repeat once again that he was not going to betroth himself to Lady Lily. She asked why he was saying it a second time, and the Duke said he just wanted to clarify. The Duke said he had come to discuss something, as he had gone to the association a few days ago, and had accidentally learned something. He looked at her closely and said that he recognized that she was looking for the ice attribute. The Duke asked in surprise why she needed the ice attribute, and he also wanted to know if she really wanted to meet an ice mage. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked how he knew about it. Psyche thought that it seemed like he was following her. The Duke now realized that he hadn't even come up with an excuse. He said that she had made an appointment at the association and that the receptionists had told him everything. She knew that the information stored in the association was supposed to be strictly classified, which meant that he had connections to know about something like this. Psyche looked at the Duke intently and said that she wanted to know more about the northern monsters. He was surprised that she confessed so quickly. She said that monsters are weak against the cold. He looked at her in surprise and asked if it was true and where this information came from. The Duke looked at her and said he meant she was not lying. The lady said that was the main question he should have asked. She said she was lucky enough to find information about it in her family library. She looked at him and told him to understand her correctly, as she could not show the contents of the book due to their situation. In the southern part of the empire, where the territory of Silkisia is located, there are many dungeons, so they carried out a lot of different research. The Duke said that it seemed like there were a lot of monsters because of their fire attack. She said that they should use moonstone dust. The Duke was surprised, as they never applied moonstone dust to weapons, as moonstone corrodes iron. She said that she tried to search the Magic Association for attributes against monsters, but she found nothing. The Duke was surprised, as she did her job well. He wondered if she really wanted a divorce so badly. The Duke looked at her and asked if she had a lover. The young lady was surprised. He said that she was helping him to take the ring off her. For this reason, he assumed that she had any man. The young lady looked at him intently and said that it was not so. The Duke said she could be honest with him since they were partners. She said she wouldn't lie to him. The young lady sighed heavily and said that due to certain circumstances, she simply needed a divorce. The Duke looked at her with a smile and said that he would never believe her. She said that she did not care whether he believed it or not. The Duke wondered why she tried to hide this from him. He thought that perhaps his assistant was right. He knew that the lady he had known before could give up everything for her family, but now she had decided to go against everyone. He thought that something had clearly happened to her and said that since she had come so far, he would like to ask her for something. He asked if he could go to the association with her tomorrow. The young lady looked at him intently and agreed. The Duke looked at the young lady with puzzlement, but said nothing. She knew it wasn't quite what she had planned, but nothing would happen if he went with her. The young lady entered her room and saw a new bouquet of flowers. The lady looked at the maid and said that she would like to take the tea from her and brew it herself from tomorrow. The maid, puzzled, said that he had already been taken away. The young lady looked at the maid intently and said that in that case she could go. The young lady in turn knew that nothing like this had happened last time. She knew that her brother gave her tea until she was completely exhausted. She drank it until her death. She couldn't believe that she would die like this, as she always believed that her family truly cared for her, yet she drank a drop of poison a day. Psyche thought that it was a mistake to leave a few tea leaves at the bottom of the cup. All she remembered was a slight dizziness after she drank it. Although she could not prove anything, she knew that she would not fall for their trick. Again, she just had to pretend to continue drinking the poisons. She knew that judging by the state of the bouquet, the tea was indeed poisonous, and she had been drinking it for many years. She knew that they wanted to kill her. Psyche wanted to go to the temple and wash after all the work. Iseult looked at his master and said that meeting with the young lady was a bad idea. He asked the master to think better of it. He did not understand how the master could be in a company he knew nothing about. He sighed heavily and, looking at the gentleman, said that at least he tried to protect him from this. He said that he really couldn't believe it, since after this meeting the young lady could learn about his weaknesses. The Duke looked at the assistant and told him not to worry. The young lady met with the Duke. The Duke looked at the young lady with a smile on his face. A moment later, he took her hand and kissed it tenderly. The Duke looked at the young lady with a smile and said that, looking at her, he knew that today would be his best day. A moment later, he said that it was time for them to go. The young lady noticed that there were a lot of people in the area. The Duke looked at the young lady and asked if she had practiced fencing yesterday. Psyche said that she had. As she practiced fencing every day, he looked at her in surprise and said that he had never heard from her family that she was good with the ball. Psyche in turn sighed heavily and said that they hated what she did. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise, as everything seemed very strange to him. He wondered what the reason was. He knew that, of course, not everyone could admit that a lady could hold a sword in her hands. The Duke wondered if they should not support an adopted child to raise the family's status. He knew it would be a different matter if the lady herself did not want it. He knew that besides the possibilities, there was another catch: the lady had a chance to push the heir into the background with such talent. A moment later, the man looking at the young people asked them to come into the room. The young lady looked closely at the young men and asked with a smile who these impudent guys were who had come to see her. The young lady looked at the Duke and said that he was just an impudent child. The Duke looked at her with fury and asked who else was a child here. She asked with a smile if she could also call him a baby. The young lady looked at the young guests and said that they should come in and sit down, and she used magic. Looking at the lady, she asked if her name was Psyche. The young lady said with a smile that their baby had an eye like an eagle, as a very pretty lady had come with him. The Duke looked at her with fury and told her to stop mocking and talking nonsense. The lady asked what the matter was that they had come to her about. She looked at them closely and said that she understood the essence of the request, but she was interested in why they needed it. She asked what they were going to do. The young lady said that Psyche had come to place an order. She asked the Duke how he knew about it. The Duke asked if it was important now, and also asked if she had any information. The young lady smiled and said that of course she had the information. Psyche looked at her in surprise and asked if it was true the lady said that it was, and also asked what she would get in return. Psyche said that when she made the order, she paid the expenses in advance. The young lady looked at her in surprise and said that it was the price just for meeting with her. The Duke looked at her with fury and asked what she wanted this time. The young lady smiled, looking at the Duke, and said that he was still very clever. A moment later, the young lady cast magic, and the Duke's hands appeared with the coordinates of the auction house. She looked at them and said that there were rumors that the very same item had appeared there. She said that she really needed this item. The Duke was furious because he knew that if she had not known about his weakness, she would never have asked for such a thing. But the lady asked him for forgiveness with a smile because she knew that no one but him would get it for her. The young lady in turn, looking at the Duke, wondered whether they were really supposed to carry out this task instead of payment. The Duke sighed heavily and agreed, and also asked what kind of item she needed so much. The young lady looked at the young men and said that she would like to receive the poisonous necklace with needles. Psyche was shocked as she realized what kind of necklace they were talking about. She froze in shock and could not utter a word. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise and said that she had said earlier that she no longer wanted him because of the failure. The Duke looked at her and asked if it was worth talking about it right now. The young lady hesitated and said that she had made a mistake since a lady from the Silkachia family had come with him. The young lady in turn thought that her assumptions were wrong, and perhaps it was a different necklace. Psyche looked at the young lady and apologized for interfering, but she was curious about the necklace. She asked what the necklace looked like. The young lady in turn was surprised as she realized that Psyche was interested in it. The young lady in turn wondered whether the girl didn't know or wanted to make sure. The young lady looked at it and said it was an ordinary gold necklace with a large emerald. Psyche in turn realized that they were thinking about the same necklace. She was shocked and wondered how this could happen. And she was also curious why the lily necklace was at an illegal auction. The young lady in turn knew that this was an unpleasant story, which is why they did not tell her, but she saw that her reaction was very strange. The young lady looked at the girl intently and asked if she really didn't know. The young lady came even closer to her and asked if she didn't know the story about the necklace. Psyche looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The young lady wanted to know about her power. She sighed heavily and said that it was not enough for divine power. The young lady looked sideways at the Duke and asked what he had done to the lady. The Duke looked at her in surprise, as he did not understand what she was talking about. Psyche froze in surprise. She did not understand what they were talking about. The young lady asked her if she didn't feel it. The young lady told the girl that it seemed like she really had inherited Silcassia's abilities. Psyche knew that this was not true, since she was merely cursed. She knew it was just a curse and nothing more. She froze and could not utter a word. The young lady, in turn, knew that she must not reveal her secret. She trembled and said that it was not so, and she knew nothing. She knew that she had a curse, and if anyone found out about it, a bloody war would begin in the empire. The young lady looked at the girl in surprise and puzzled, asked her to calm down and pull herself together. The Duke looked at his bride in surprise. He wondered if these were the feelings of the young lady. Because of the ring, he could feel everything. The young lady approached Psyche and offered her some water and asked if she had calmed down. Psyche thanked her for her concern. She thought that it must have looked very strange. Psyche looked at those present and asked for forgiveness. She said that because of a severe headache, sometimes this happens to her. The young lady looked at the girl in surprise and said that she seemed to be very unwell and that they should end the conversation there as she needed to rest. The young lady looked at the Duke and said that he should get the necklace at the auction, and in return, she would give them a magical ice attribute that could resist the monster and medicine. The Duke looked at her in surprise and said that it was very generous of her, but he did not understand why she decided to do so. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really meant to say that she had not been generous before. She said that actually it was an illegal auction, so it was not necessary to spend your money. She said that you could get the necklace illegally. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she was completely crazy. The young lady smiled and said that this was the most interesting. A moment later, the Duke said that he understood everything. The Duke looked at the young lady closely and said that she seemed to be feeling unwell and that he could walk her home. But the young lady said that there was no need for that and that she would go herself. The Duke still agreed with her, although he said that they had more to discuss, so he would come to her tomorrow. He also said that it would be best for her to call a doctor to examine her. The young man looked closely at his master and asked excitedly if he had been discovered. The Duke asked the young man in surprise why he did not trust him so much. Iseult knew that the Duke was very hot-tempered and would grab his sword at any opportunity. The Duke looked at the young man closely and said that if he had so much free time, he should better find out if Lady Lily had been to the temple of Vicente, since he could not send a raven to the temple. The young man said that the lady had gone to the temple on the first day of her return, and also when she took the kinship test. The Duke thought for a moment, as this was all very strange. He knew that the one who inherited this ability would only be able to know it after a ritual in the temple conducted by the high priest. And since the high priest was away and had recently returned, she had not visited the temple yet. Long ago, during the founding of the empire, the god of fate, who favored the emperor, decided to give him a gift. Fearing that power would be given to him alone by the emperor, he begged God to share the gift with his supporters, and God agreed with him. Thus, 4 families emerged that received the blessing of God. Ristir in the north, Evergeen in the east, Stella in the west, Silcassia in the south. At that time, only one person in one generation could be born with abilities. But there was a time when even such people were not born in the family. In order to confirm the abilities, it was necessary to undergo a ritual in the temple with the high priest. The Duke knew that the abilities were distributed equally among the families, but he thought it was very strange that the Duke did not check Lady Lily's abilities. The Duke thought that perhaps he already knew who the real owner of the abilities was. The Duke thought about it, for he knew that the young lady Psyche had been adopted, and it was all very strange. The Duke was puzzled, as he still could not understand the secret of the young lady's family. He knew that nothing could be certain. The young lady, in turn, wondered if her excuse sounded too unnatural. She knew that she didn't need to think about such things. Now she knew that they themselves were simply surprised by what was happening. A moment later, she froze in place as she saw the carriage she raised that the Duke had returned home. Entering the estate, she noticed that all the servants were sweeping and sewing. She understood that since the Duke and Lady Lily had returned, there would soon be a banquet. Psyche, in turn, did not want to take part in this celebration, but she still knew that hardly anyone would listen to her. She wanted to pretend that she was ill. As she passed the Duke's office, she heard a noise. She was surprised because she heard that the Duke was very angry. Izara apologized to the Duke and said that he could not contact him. He said that Lilia passed all the tests in the temple and she responded to his blood. The Duke shouted in rage that this was simply impossible. The Duke shouted that she could not return, since he had done it with his own hands. The young man looked at the Duke in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The Duke sighed heavily and told his son that he would find out everything, but for now he could go. He said that it did not matter how it happened. The Duke shouted that Psyche was much more important now. A moment later, he looked at the door in surprise and asked if there was anyone outside. The young man went out into the corridor. Looking back, he unfortunately did not notice anyone. The young lady in turn hid she was trembling with fear because she did not know what to do in this situation. Izara walked towards the young lady. She was trembling with fear and praying that no one would notice her, but suddenly the young man heard someone's voice. Turning around, he saw the young lady with her brother Lily, smiled, and said that she heard that their father had finally returned. Psyche sighed heavily, as she was glad that no one noticed her. The young lady in her turn was very much puzzled and did not know what the Duke's words meant. She wondered if he was not glad to have his daughter back. She remembered him screaming that she was much more important. A moment later, she cast all thoughts aside as she heard someone knocking on her door. A moment later, the Duke entered her room and said that he heard she had gone somewhere. The young lady lowered her gaze to the floor, but did not answer him. She asked if he really had anything to tell her. The Duke said it had been a long time since they had seen each other. He asked if she was not glad to see her father. The young lady timidly asked how he was doing. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and said that there would soon be a celebration in the garden for his and Lily's return. He said that everyone would be at the celebration, so she should be there too. The young lady in turn asked for forgiveness and said that she was not feeling well. The Duke looked at her with surprise and bewilderment and asked if she really didn't even want to look at him. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was difficult for her to even move because of the pain. A moment later, the Duke's face changed, and with a radiant smile, he took his daughter by the hand and said that he very much wanted her to come to the party. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand why he was behaving in such a way. Some time later, she still decided to come to the celebration, passing by the maids. She heard their conversation. They were whispering and discussing her. The young lady in turn was puzzled, as she saw that the Duke's behavior was very strange. She did not understand why he behaved like that, since he had never spoken to her kindly, before she knew that she needed to watch what was happening. A moment later, she saw her entire family gathered. Lily, with a radiant smile, rushed towards the young lady and said that she was very glad to see her. Psyche looked closely at the young lady and asked if it was because she looked better in comparison. Lily looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Psyche looked at the young lady with a smirk and said that she too was glad that she was back. Psyche, in turn, knew that if it weren't for the young lady, who she would have continued to live in hell. Psyche, I said that they needed to celebrate her return to the family. The Duke looked at everyone and said with a smile that today was such a happy day, that his daughter had returned home. He smiled and said that, although everyone already knew her, he would like to formally introduce her once again. The Duke smiled and pointed to his daughter, Lily. The young lady, in turn, glowed with happiness. Psyche, in turn, knew that she had come to this event in vain, since there was no place for her here. The Duke looked at everyone present and said that since his daughter Lily had returned, Psyche was no longer the heir to their family. The young lady froze in shock. The Duke said that from now on she was no longer part of the family, and she was forbidden to use the family's property, and she was no longer an aristocrat. She knew those were the words he would say. The Duke looked at the young lady closely and said with a smile that since Lily had returned, they should also not forget that Lady Psyche was a member of the family. Psyche froze in shock, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The Duke said with a smile that Psyche was also Silkisia, and the people looked at the Duke in surprise. The Duke smiled as he looked at the young lady and said that he really hoped that she would set an example of upbringing for her as the eldest sister of the family. He said with a smile that he relied on her very much. The young people froze in indignation. They did not understand why their father said such a thing. Psyche was in shock. She wondered why he didn't strip her of her title and put her in the family. She didn't understand why he did this, since she alone didn't expect this at all. Izura looked at his father in surprise and said that he called a girl sister, who was not their real sister. He told his father that maybe he was confused. But a moment later, the Duke slapped his son across the face with fury. The Duke looked at him with fury and said that he had previously told him to be careful and watch the young lady. He shouted that she had changed and also asked his son what he had been doing all this time. The ring shouted that the one who had always obeyed him had changed. The young man asked his father for forgiveness in confusion. The Duke was furious and asked since when everything had changed. The young man hesitated and said that it turned out that everything had changed since the day Lily returned to the family. The Duke sighed heavily when he heard the young lady's name. He looked at his son and asked what she had been doing lately. The Duke shouted to his son that he was asking about Psyche. He said he saw her talking to a soldier. Izura said he saw her getting close to him, but he can find any reason to dismiss him from service. And other than frequent meetings with the Duke, nothing much happened. The Duke thought for a moment and asked if the lady had decided to go to the Duke. He said that he doubted that the Duke would accept her. The young man said that he would certainly appoint soldiers to watch her. The Duke looked at his son with fury and asked how he planned to assign someone much smarter than him to spy on her. The Duke shouted that no matter what they had to gain her loyalty, she shouted at her son to make her understand that her place was only next to them. The young man sighed heavily and said that he understood his father's words. He was puzzled and very angry because he did not understand what was so special about the young lady. He knew that their father had never had tender feelings for his children, and from the very beginning, he could not believe that Psyche was a replacement for Lily. The Duke brought her into the house, from those times pretended that he did not care about her, isolating her from everyone. He raised her daily, subjecting her to brainwashing. Izar did not understand, and for what it was all for. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and said that she had something to say to him. She said that she intended to go with him tomorrow. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was talking about. He was shocked and asked if she really intended to go with him. He looked at her intently and asked if she was serious about this. The Duke sighed heavily and said that this would not happen. The young lady, sipping tea, calmly said that this was the illegal auction that Mrs. Leah had mentioned. The Duke looked at her intently and asked if she knew why they were going there. Psyche looked at him intently and said that, of course, she knew both of them were going to steal the necklace. She knew that there had been a similar incident in the past. Although she didn't remember the exact date of everything that had happened, she knew that around the same time she had been unable to meet with the Duke. Now she knew that this time they were going with a specific goal set by her. But then the Duke also had plans with Leah. She thought that most likely he could not achieve what he wanted. She thought that perhaps he could not steal the necklace then. The Duke looked at the young lady with surprise and bewilderment and asked what she was thinking about so intently she in turn could not tell him about it, knowing that he would fail. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she was not telling him this to get his permission. She said that she was simply warning him in advance so that he would cover the ring. The Duke looked at the ring in surprise as it glowed slightly. He knew that when the ring bearers were close to each other, the Duke was puzzled and did not understand why an ordinary ring needed such properties. He thought that it was all very complicated. He looked at her intently and said that nothing would happen if she was far away. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she would go with him, not because she wanted to go. The Duke looked at the young lady with surprise and bewilderment. A moment later, looking at her, he asked if she was doing this so that nothing would happen. He asked if she really didn't want to break off the engagement, so she decided to ruin it. The young lady looked at him in surprise but did not answer. She was in shock, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. A moment later, she sighed heavily and asked if she could be honest with him. The Duke looked at her intently and said that whatever she told him now, he would listen to her. She looked at him intently and said that she wanted to end the marriage right now. The young lady said that their engagement rested solely on him. She said that he was afraid of not receiving the help of the knightly order and of falling into disfavor with the emperor. The Duke looked hard at the young lady, but said nothing. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and said that she understood him. She truly understood him because she had behaved the same way in the past. Psyche said that people tend to change, and she no longer had feelings for him and never had and never would. The Duke looked at the young lady with a puzzled expression as he had not expected to hear such a thing at all. She said that under any circumstances, she wanted to end their marriage. The young lady sighed heavily and said that since they had finished their conversation, she would leave him. The Duke in turn shouted at her to wait, as they were not finished. Yet he was surprised that she had just left. The young lady in turn understood that she had to immediately prepare for tomorrow. A moment later, she froze in place as she saw the young lady. Lily looked at her intently and said that she had something to talk about. Lily looked at the young lady in surprise and asked how she could do this to her. Psyche looked at her in bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. Lily looked at her with fury and said that she would give her everything that was rightfully hers, the title and the engagement. Lily looked at the young lady with tears in her eyes and said that she was just a liar. Psyche sighed heavily and said that she had already returned everything that was hers. Lily was furious. She screamed that this was not true and was already crossing all boundaries. Lily screamed with tears in her eyes that initially all this belonged to her. She screamed that when the true owner returned, everything had to be given to him. She screamed because she was furious and did not understand why the Duke and her father loved her, because she was just a fake, not real. Psyche knew that in the past, the Duke had not accepted Lily in the same way as the daughter of the family. She did not behave the way she behaved now. Psyche knew that the young lady was pretending to be innocent and kind, pretending to sympathize with her. Lily shouted to the young lady that she was up to something. Lily shouted that only with her she behaves very coldly, but when she communicates with her father and the Duke, she is white and fluffy. Psyche, in turn, understood her words better than anyone else, since she knew that it was very terrible when everything that belonged to her was taken away in one moment by someone unknown. For this reason, she did not want to comfort her, since the victim cannot comfort the hunter. Psyche looked at the young lady intently and said that she had no need to exaggerate. Psyche said that after her return, she did not ask anyone to leave her in the family. Lily looked angrily at the young lady and asked if she really thought that she would believe this. Psyche calmly said that to believe or not was her right. Psyche looked at the young lady intently and said that if she did not believe her, she could go and tell her father right now and insist that he send her away right then. Psyche looked at the young lady intently and asked if she was afraid to do this. Psyche came closer to her and told her to think carefully, because if she were to pray to her father or the Duke for anything, she would be in first place for them. Psyche came closer to her and told her to just look reality and into her eyes. Psyche looked calmly at the young lady and said that she had not done anything in particular. Psyche said that now she is trying to blame her for everything. Psyche told the young lady that if she did not want the whole world to know of her worthlessness, it would be better if she did not stand in her way. The young lady in turn knew that she had no plans for the next few days. She knew that this was very good, otherwise it might cause some difficulties. Yesterday, she spoke very rudely to the young lady, and she did not approach her anymore. She thought that the brothers would come to her in order to protect their sister, but this did not happen. She was very interested in what effect her words had on the Duke. The young lady, in turn, was slowly getting ready for the mission. She looked closely at her reflection in the mirror and wondered how easy it would be for her to move around in these clothes. The young man looked at the young lady intently and asked her in confusion where she was going. So late, the young lady in turn said that she was going for a short walk. He looked at her and told her to be sure to take the soldiers with her. She said that there was no need for this since she wanted to be alone, and her husband's punishment was still in force. Izar looked at her and said that this was his father's order. The young lady looked at her brother in bewilderment. She was surprised. Psyche, in turn, knew that arguing with her brother was a waste of time, so she had to agree. She glanced sideways at the knight and wondered if she should knock him out and leave. Aiden looked at the young lady closely and called out to her. She looked at him in surprise. Aiden told the young lady that he would wait for her here and she could go wherever she wanted. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she had not expected to hear such a thing. A moment later, she asked him if he knew where she was going. He sighed heavily and said that he did not know where she was going. She asked him if he knew when she would be back. She wondered if he had decided to help her. She looked at him closely, as he seemed very kind and attentive. The young man looked at the young lady intently and said that last time he wanted to introduce himself. A moment later, he said his name was Aiden Hillies. The young lady froze in shock, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She knew that he was from the Baron's family, and it was one of the families that served Silixia. The Baron himself was remembered by her as a very vile person, and they were completely different from each other. She wondered if the Baron was such a greedy person that he sent his son to serve another family. He looked at her intently and said that he had no contact with his family, and he left from there. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she didn't expect to hear such a thing. Aiden looked at the young lady intently and said that, simply put, she could trust him with ease because he, like her, had nothing to lose. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked why she should trust him. He said there was a way to test it, as he wanted her to go with him to the Temple of Fate. The young lady knew that you had been telling her to go to the temple a lot lately. She also knew that this was not surprising. She looked at him intently and said that she was very sorry. But these checks were no longer useful since the young lady had returned to her family, and there was no need for her to go there. He looked at her closely and said that he was not telling her about this. She did not want to believe his words. You asked for forgiveness, and said that you did not want to see her at all. He knew that if the ranch had intervened, everything could have been different. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really wanted to go to the temple, pretending not to know her. He looked at her intently and said that this was not so. He said that he had entered the service of the house from the very beginning in order to see her. The young lady looked at the young man in surprise, as she did not understand why he was saying such a thing. Aiden looked at the young lady and said that if she was against it, he would no longer force himself on her, but he would soon be kicked out, so he would not want to lose the chance to talk to her. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment and asked what he was talking about. He looked at her intently and said that he thought she had some urgent business to attend to now. But if she wanted to continue the conversation, he would wait for her at this place in a week, and with all courtesy, he bowed and asked her to take care of herself. The young lady was a little puzzled. She didn't know if she could believe him, but she knew that she didn't have time to think about it. Now the young lady in turn agreed, and said that they would meet at this place in a week. A moment later, the young lady took out a cape and gloves. She wanted to disguise herself so that no one would recognize her. She sighed, because she could not imagine that she would use the bracelet in such a way. She knew that if she charged it with mana and spun it a few times, her appearance would change. The young lady, in turn, wondered if she was going in the right direction. She knew that although this magical attribute disguised her perfectly, she took it because she was afraid that she might be recognized. She knew that the imperial family had rented the building for illegal trade, and judging by the ring, the Duke should already be inside. A moment later, the young lady approached the man and told him the password that would allow her inside. She knew the Duke thought she couldn't get in on her own, but she had learned the password to enter the auction house beforehand while she was dealing with her brother's affairs. A moment later, the man looked at the boy and said that he could come out. The young lady, in turn, knew that the Duke had gone a different way than the one Leah had spoken of, but she was still very worried and wondered if he was okay. She thought that he might have decided to check out the situation. After some time, the young lady was already sitting in the hall, where the bidding was going on. Although everything was going smoothly, the feeling of anxiety did not leave her. She knew that being next to an active person, it would be difficult to sit in ignorance. The young lady froze in place as she recognized the person sitting next to her. It was Hilvia. The young lady looked at the lady in surprise, as she had a disguise, which was what was needed. Psyche wondered if the lady was aware that because of the fan, she was easily recognized. Psyche saw that the young lady had taken all the bets she knew, that there were rumors that the Marquis was going through hard times in terms of budget, but what the Marquis was doing was simply absurd. The man looked at all the ladies and gentlemen present and said that the next lot, which they had all been waiting for a long time, was the highlight of their auction. The young lady, in turn, understood that the necklace had not yet been exhibited, and perhaps this was their highlight. She was puzzled since the Duke was still not there. She wondered whether he could steal this lot or whether she should buy it. A moment later, the man said with a smile that he would like to present them with the next lot of the Khitan necklace 20 years ago. Lady Lais gave the beautiful princess an emerald necklace. However, the necklace was a secret. It could bristle with poisoned needles. Before the crown princess put it on herself, the death of the maid who stole the necklace and put it on was investigated. As a result of the investigation, Lais was arrested for attempting to murder the princess. 2 years after the crown prince took the throne, he showed mercy to her because her family was of great importance in the empire. The young lady was puzzled and thought that it was very strange, because if it was about an attempt on the life of the imperial family, then the punishment should have been immediate execution. She knew that he allowed her to be released from prison. She understood that the story seemed real, but so delirious from the point of view of the law. The young lady was in shock. She did not understand why she was dragging others along with her if she herself had decided to die. Psyche was a little puzzled and didn't understand why she felt so strange now. A moment later, a terrible explosion thundered in the hall. The young lady in turn wondered if the Duke had caused the explosion. Looking at the ring, she realized that he was inside the building. Everyone present was in shock. They didn't understand what was going on. They shouted that it was very dangerous, and they needed to get out of the building as soon as possible. The man looked at everyone present with a puzzled smile and asked them to calm down a little. He said that it seemed that the workers' moving boxes accidentally caused this earthquake. He said that they would check everything immediately. But a moment later, another explosion thundered, and the young lady realized that now she had to act. The young lady, in turn, ran with lightning speed to the rescue of the Duke. The young men looked at the young man and said that he had entered a forbidden area, so he must leave it immediately. The young lady dealt with them with lightning speed, and with lightning speed she escaped from them. The men were in shock and shouted that the young man had to be seized immediately. The young lady understood that she was already approaching the Duke, and she needed to hurry. Everything seemed very strange to her, since after the explosion he went somewhere. But now he stood still. She knew that last time he failed this task. She thought that this time he would succeed. She was interested in what happened. At the same time, the Duke was dealing with the mercenaries. He was furious as he saw that their number was growing even larger. A moment later, he was surrounded, and men were shouting that they needed to block the exit. They couldn't let him out of the building. They looked at him with fury and shouted that he was finished. A moment later, the Duke stood dumbfounded, wondering if someone else had broken in. A moment later, he saw a young man dealing with the mercenaries. The Duke froze in shock as he saw silver hair. A moment later, he saw his ring glowing on his finger. He looked closely at the young man and realized who he really was. He remembered the young lady saying that her family didn't like her mouth of work. He looked at her with surprise and a smile, because this spectacle was worth it. He knew that the young lady undoubtedly had talent, and compared to her, her brothers were simply insignificant. The Duke, in turn, understood that it was more difficult than he thought, since it was difficult to overcome such a number of people at once. A moment later, the young lady came closer to him and asked if he had found the necklace. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it was a trap, and the necklace was a fake. The young lady froze in shock as she saw the wound on the Duke's arm. The Duke said with a smile that it looked like there was a curse on this necklace. He said that, from the very beginning, they had come up with a bait for those who were tracking the necklace, and the organizers could cancel the auction under any pretext. She looked at him in surprise and asked if that was why he was asked to steal the necklace and not win the bidding. The Duke sighed heavily and said with bewilderment that it seemed she only wanted to find out if it was a trap or not. The young lady looked at the Duke closely, as it seemed to her that he was not particularly worried about the situation. She in turn wondered if this could be called a coordinated work between them. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said that she must have noticed it herself, but they had to leave as soon as possible. In order to save mana, she stopped using disguise. The young lady looked at the Duke with bewilderment and asked what would happen to their task. The Duke said that she knew everything herself, so they only needed to show the fake and nothing more. The Duke knew that if the young lady had not come, he would have solved this problem. But if things continued like this, the curse of the necklace would spread throughout his body. He understood that she saved him. The Duke in turn knew that he must be sure to thank the young lady when they returned home. The Duke looked at the young lady with a serious, intent look and asked if she would like to spar after they returned. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment. Psyche was very surprised. She said that she had heard that he had rejected many challenges to a duel, explaining this by the lack of skill of the opponent. The Duke looked at her with puzzlement and bewilderment and asked what she meant. The young lady in turn smiled as she realized that the Duke recognized her sword skills. A moment later, she agreed with a smile and said that she would like to fight him. The Duke looked at the young lady with surprise and bewilderment, for he saw that she smiled, and he smiled back at her, and thought that her smile was simply beautiful. The Duke was shocked. He thought that he must be crazy to think about such a thing. A moment later, he pushed her away and shouted at her to be careful. The young lady fell to the ground, and the Duke in turn crashed into the wall. Psyche was in shock. She did not understand what was happening at all and screamed at the Duke, but he did not answer. The Duke in turn realized that this blow gave him back control over the flame was furious, as he realized that his power was out of control again. A moment later, a man approached them and said with a grin that he knew they would be here. He was surprised, because he didn't expect there to be two of them. The young lady looked at the man with fury as she knew that he was a very big problem for them. Now she was furious as he saw her face. The young lady looked closely at the Duke. She saw that he was in great pain. She knew that he could have easily dodged, but still covered her with his body. She understood that now he was not in a state to fight. She looked at the man with a sharp, angry look, as she realized that she had to get rid of him herself. The man looked at her with a smirk and asked if she really wanted to fight him. Looking at the young lady, he said that it was just ridiculous. A moment later, the man attacked her with fury, shouting that she was still very brave. The young lady in turn fought off the man. The man said with a grin that this would be good training for him. The man looked at her as he dealt blow after blow and asked if she really thought she could defeat him with that level of skill. The young lady in turn was a little puzzled as she saw that it was difficult to deal with him. She understood that if she continued to fight, then other soldiers would certainly come. She was glad that he did not recognize her. She knew she couldn't fight him. Psyche knew she had no choice but to release the mana and destroy him. A moment later, she finally released her power, and a bright light enveloped her. The man looked at the young lady with surprise and confusion. He did not understand where such strength came from. The young lady was in shock as she knew she was at her limit. She was furious and cursing her ability. A moment later, the Duke came to and froze. Looking at the young lady, he saw that the flames were raging strongly in his body. But a moment later, he felt everything calm down. He knew that the only ability that could calm his flames was the power of the descendants of the Silxia family. The Duke was puzzled, for he realized that his wound was more serious than he had supposed, and he could not control his strength. He was furious because he realized that he was in serious trouble. He heard that there was a battle going on and realized that the young lady was fighting alone. He knew that the opponent was not so simple. He was much stronger and more agile than her. He understood that, even if it was a sudden attack, he hit very hard. He was furious as he understood that the cursed flame his family's was a force that could consume even the bearer himself. A moment later, he felt a strange feeling. He didn't understand what was happening, as his flame was fading. He saw a young lady fighting with an opponent. A moment later, the young lady froze in shock as she saw the man surrounded by light. She was in shock as she saw the flames consuming him. A moment later, the man fell to the ground with a crash. The young lady turned around as she knew whose flame it was. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she had done very well after all. But the young lady knew that this was not so, for her legs gave way, and she fell to the ground with a crash. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was feeling better already. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said that, thanks to her, he had regained his strength. The young lady sighed heavily, and looking away, said that she understood him. The Duke told the young lady not to pay attention to the man. He said that if a man was working at an illegal auction with such force, then he was a real criminal. The young lady in turn knew that this was not the case. Psyche was a little puzzled, as she felt very strange. She felt different than usual, and she had the feeling that her magic was getting stronger. She was in shock as she realized that even her sword was frozen. She knew that she could not let the Duke see what had happened. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if her sword was broken. The young lady said that everything was fine since the sword was old, and she would buy herself a new one later. A moment later, the Duke extended his hand to the young lady and told her to rise as it was time for them to go. The young lady accepted his help and thanked him with a smile. But her legs still wouldn't obey her, and she fell right on top of the Duke. She was puzzled because for the first time in so long, using her power, she felt such a heaviness in her whole body. She could not believe that this could happen to her. It seemed to her that the Duke's flame was flaring up again. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise. He wondered if she had hidden her power. He thought that since she controlled her power so well, it was only natural that he had not noticed it before. The young lady, in turn, shyly asked the Duke to let her go. The Duke was taken aback as he realized that he had made a mistake, and with the speed of lightning, he let go of her and, asking for forgiveness, said that he simply could not control his power properly. The young lady looked closely at his hand and said that everything was fine. A moment later, she glanced at him sideways and said that, unfortunately, she had no strength left, so she would hardly be able to change her appearance. The Duke looked at the young lady closely and said that it was okay, since he couldn't use disguise either. Psyche said that in that case, they needed to get out of the building as quickly as possible. The Duke looked at her intently and said that they were out and needed to turn the corner. A moment later, the young lady stumbled and the Duke called to her in surprise. The young lady froze in place as she felt very ill. A moment later, she fell to the ground and the Duke managed to catch her. He screamed, but there was no answer. The young girl was very cold. She wanted to eat, her whole body ached. She was puzzled and did not understand why no one came for her. She wondered if that person had really abandoned her. The maid looked at the young lady with a smile and asked if she was awake. Psyche looked at the maid with surprise and confusion and asked where she was. The maid smiled, looking at the young lady, and said that she was at the Duke of Rastier's estate. The young lady was shocked as she did not expect to hear such a thing. Leah looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if he was still alive. The Duke looked at her with surprise and a smile and asked if he had really upset her so much with this. The young lady made no reply, but a moment later, she asked what about the necklace. The Duke placed the necklaces on the table and asked her if she knew that the necklace was a fake. She looked at him in surprise and asked if it was true, and also asked if he had figured it out himself or if someone had helped him. A moment later, she handed him the medicine and the data on the monsters. He looked at Leah intently and said that there was an artificially created monster in the auction house, and it must be the work of alchemists. He said that he spent all his power on the monster and the soldiers, but thanks to the lady, he survived. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if he had really taken Lady Psyche with him. The Duke looked at her with a smile and asked what her reaction was. The Duke looked at her closely and said that the forbidden magic and the necklaces seemed to be connected somehow. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really thought they were related to him, looked intently at Ilya Hilash, and said that as the bearer of the unquenchable flame, and as the Duke ruling the northern lands, he would like to ask something. The Duke asked if Lady Psyche was the daughter of her sister Lias. The young lady looked at the Duke with fury and told him to stop talking. She told him with fury not to cross the line. Leah looked at him with fury and said that Psyche had nothing to do with her. The Duke looked at her in bewilderment and asked why she was interested in her. Then she said that she was simply curious and nothing more. She looked at him with fury and shouted at him to leave immediately, otherwise she would not be responsible for herself. The Duke looked closely at Leah and realized that he had provoked her in vain. Silcasia family's ability was eternal ice, and from Leah's reaction and how she became interested in her, it meant that Psyche was not a fake. Now the Duke had no doubt about it. The servants looked intently at the master and greeted him. The Duke looked closely at everyone present and asked what was wrong with the lady. Iseult looked at the gentleman and said that the lady asked to be returned to the mansion immediately. A moment later, the young lady approached the Duke and called him. The Duke looked at her in surprise as he did not expect her to rise to her feet so quickly. He saw that she had difficulty standing. Brandia looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was feeling better already. He said that he was very scared when she suddenly lost consciousness. The young lady in turn said that she was fine. She knew that she had to pretend that she was fine, although she was very dizzy, but she did not understand why this was so. Her body had never reacted to abilities like this. She said she wanted to go home already. The Duke said he had already sent the letter. He looked at her closely and said she didn't need to worry about such things, and it would be better for her to rest some more. The young lady was surprised because she did not expect that he would take care of everything and send letters. A moment later, she remembered the night she knew that a whole day had passed, and if the letter had been sent, it meant that the knight had been caught not escorting her properly. She looked at him intently and said that she had to leave urgently and asked if he could lend her his carriage. The Duke looked at her puzzled and said that judging by her appearance, she was not well. Psyche said that if he did not give her a carriage, she would rent one herself since she had urgent business. Brandia, in turn, realized that the young lady would not stay at the estate. He looked at her closely and agreed. The Duke said that she still looked bad, so he could not let her go alone. He said that he would certainly accompany her. The young lady looked at him in surprise as she did not expect to hear such a thing, but still knew that she had no choice. Some time later, the two of them were riding to the young lady's estate. She sighed heavily and said that he could just give her a carriage. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and said that after all, she was his fiancée and had suffered because of him. He asked how he could leave her alone. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was not so at all, since she had lost consciousness not because of him. The Duke looked at her closely and asked if she was ill in some way. The young lady sighed heavily and said something like that. He looked at her closely and realized that she was uncomfortable around him. The Duke, in turn, knew that besides her abilities, there were other things that interested him in her. He would like to stay alone with her for some time. The Duke was in shock because he did not understand what he was thinking about again. He looked at her intently and said that she had previously said that she wanted to end their marriage. He asked if he could know the reason the young lady looked at him in bewilderment and asked why he was asking. The Duke looked away from her and said timidly that he was simply curious. Psyche looked intently at the Duke, but in turn did not answer. He said that she had helped him recently, so now he would like to help her with something. The young lady, in turn, said that he helped her enough. When she lost consciousness, he brought her to him. The Duke realized that the young lady did not trust him. Some time later, they arrived at the place, and the Duke, with all courtesy, offered her his hand, which the young lady in turn accepted. Lennox looked at the young people in surprise and shouted angrily at his sister. A moment later, the young man ran up to the young lady with the speed of lightning and asked her furiously if she had gone completely mad. He asked her furiously what she was doing. The young man grabbed her by the shoulder and asked her angrily how she could just leave the house. Lennox shouted at her and squeezed her shoulder angrily. He asked if she knew that her father was furious right now. He asked her furiously what was happening to her. He said that, especially since their sister had returned, she had begun to behave differently. He asked if it was because of the fear of being abandoned that she had decided to run after men. The young lady in turn screamed for him to let her go. Lennox shouted at her furiously and said that he could not understand how her father still tolerated her. He shouted that she should have been sent into exile immediately. He did not have time to finish speaking when suddenly the Duke grabbed him by the arm in fury. The Duke looked at the young man with fury and asked him if he was aware that he had treated the young lady too roughly. The young man looked at the Duke with anger and asked what he was doing. He shouted at the Duke to let him go. The Duke was shocked because he understood that this was not even a secluded room, but a garden where everything was in plain sight. And even despite this, he still dared to raise his hand against his sister. The young lady looked at the Duke and told him to let the boy go, as this was not a situation where he should interfere. She knew that if they found out about Aiden's situation now, her punishment would be deserved. The young man looked at the Duke with fury and said that they would definitely report this to their father. The Duke looked at the young man intently and also said with fury that he also had something to tell the Duke. He looked at the young man and asked if the second heir of the family really treated his sick sister like that. Lennox looked at the Duke with surprise and a smile and asked where the sick young lady was. He said that she had pretended to be ill in front of the Duke again. He asked if she really thought he wouldn't find out about it. He said that she had simply been trying to arouse pity for herself in this way. The Duke looked at the young man with fury and asked if the doctor had told him that the young lady was pretending. Lennox asked in bewilderment why they had to call a doctor for this. He said it was obvious. He looked at the Duke with a grin and asked if he really believed this fool. He said she just wanted to attract attention to herself. The Duke looked at the young man with fury and said that he was not the head of the family or even the successor. So for him, his words were just empty words. The Duke said that he did not even think that he had any value in the family. Lennox looked at the Duke with fury and asked what he was talking about. Ezer approached them and, looking at the young people in surprise, asked what kind of noise they were making. Ezer was surprised because he saw the Duke. He did not expect to see him at their estate, Lennox ran up to his brother like lightning and began to complain about the Duke. He said that the Duke had grabbed his arm very painfully. Izar looked at the Duke with puzzlement and said that he had never thought that he was such a vile person. At him with fury and a grin, Izara, and asked what he was talking about. The Duke asked if this was really better than being a loyal dog on a chain. He looked at the Duke and said that if that was all he had to do, he needed to leave their estate immediately. He looked at the young lady and told her to follow him, as her father was already waiting for her. The young lady looked at the young men intently and asked what was wrong with Aiden. She in turn knew that they had no idea how bad she was feeling right now. She didn't know what was going on at all, but she saw that the mansion was now full of knights. She was a little worried and confused, as she knew that this had not happened in the past. And if she entered the mansion now, she would hardly be able to leave it. The Duke looked hard at the young lady, and I knew she had noticed. Izar looked at the young lady and said that they needed to go into the house and talk. The young lady in turn insisted. She looked at her brother and said that she wanted to know where her knight was. She knew that he was hurt since she left him alone. Izar looked at the Duke and said that he could go back to his place. The Duke in turn said that he was going to do so, but unfortunately, everything looked so exciting that he couldn't just leave. Izar looked at the Duke with fury and told him not to interfere in their family affairs. The Duke looked at the young man with a grin and said that this concerned his fiancée. Izar said angrily that first of all she was a member of their family and only then his bride. He looked at him and said that this really irritated him, and he could just start talking already. The Duke asked if this was such a big secret that he couldn't listen. The Duke looked at the young lady and asked who Edston was. The young lady said that he was the knight who accompanied her last night. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise and bewilderment, as he was surprised that the conversation had turned to an ordinary knight. He looked closely at his bride and asked if she was cheating on him. Psyche looked closely at the Duke and calmly said that she would never dare to do such a thing. The Duke looked at the young men and said with a grin that this man must have done something great for them to keep it a secret. The Duke gave Izar a nasty look and said that even though he was the successor of the family and tried to put himself above others, he had better not forget that Psyche was his fiancée. Izar was furious as he remembered that the Duke had not been particularly interested in her. He wondered if the Duke was pretending to pick on their family. He knew that if he sent him away now, he might return to them under the pretext of being her fiancée. Izar looked at the young lady and said that the knight had left the family, and no matter how good the knight was, he had no use for knights who did not obey his orders. He looked at the young lady intently and asked if she was satisfied with the answer. A moment later, he said that it was time for them to go to their father, as he was waiting for them. The young lady looked at him intently and said that she would not go. The young men looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Psyche looked at them and said that she had wanted to do this for a long time. She said that since Lily had returned to the family, there was no place for her here anymore. The only thing that kept her was her engagement to the Duke. Looking at the brothers, she said that she had no other reasons to stay in the estate. Izar looked at the young lady with fury and called her. Psyche looked at them with a piercing gaze and said that, however, since they raised her, she would continue to play the role of a daughter. A moment later, she said that she would be the Duke's bride until the monsters in the north disappeared. But after that, she would no longer stay here. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really thought she could do as she pleased. Psyche looked at him in surprise and asked what was wrong with a grown man staying in another place for a while. Izar shouted angrily at the Duke that it was none of his business. The Duke said that it concerns his bride, and he cares about her. Izar looked at the Duke in surprise and asked since when he became so attentive to the young lady. The Duke, with a grin, said that he would agree with this, since before he did not care about her properly, but from now on, he will devote maximum time to her so that she feels comfortable. The Duke looked at the young men and asked why they were leaving the knights in the mansion. He asked if there was something illegal that they were hiding. He said that there were so many knights that he could not even determine their number. The young lady looked at the Duke and thanked him for his help. The Duke smiled and said that he had done nothing at all. Psyche sighed heavily and said that she thought she would never get out of there again. The Duke, looking at the young men, asked with a smile if they were really going to do something with the young lady. A moment later, he, looking at his bride, said that they could go together and he would certainly help her with the luggage. A moment later, they were surrounded by a crowd of knights. Aiden, was he asked if he was really that important to her? Psyche looked at the Duke in confusion and asked what he was talking about. The Duke said he was only asking because she was very worried about the young man. Psyche, looking at the Duke, said that yesterday he had volunteered to help her and let her go alone, but she never returned to tell him that he understood everything. She had just barely woken up, immediately ran home, and he thought that the young man was her lover. Psyche, looking at the Duke, said that it was not so, since without it she wanted to return home. She thanked the Duke for giving her a ride and also asked if he could drop her off somewhere. The Duke wanted to know where she was going. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she had not thought about it yet and would probably stay at the capital's hotel for a couple of days. The Duke looked at the young lady closely and said with concern that the family would find her quickly. Given the situation, they would probably have the strength to bring her home, and after that, she would definitely not get out. The young lady sighed heavily, as she did not know what to do and how to act correctly in this situation. The Duke looked at her intently and said that, if she didn't mind, she could stay at his mansion. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise and asked what he was talking about. A moment later, she said timidly that she appreciated his concern very much, but she had to refuse this offer. She said that she did not think they would find her so soon if she settled somewhere on the outskirts. The Duke looked at her closely and said that it was unlikely that there would be any rooms available there, since there was a reception to celebrate the second prince's birthday. The young lady sighed heavily as she had completely forgotten about this event. A moment later, the carriage hit a rock and began to shake, and the Duke in turn managed to easily catch the young lady. He looked at her intently and said that her hands were very cold. The Duke said that unfortunately, she was not in the best condition right now. He told her to imagine what would happen to her if the knights of her family found her, since the Duke was serious about her. If it weren't for him, the Duke would never have let her go. The young lady looked at him in surprise, wondering if he was worried about her. Psyche looked at the Duke with embarrassment and said that she then entrusted herself to his care until she recovered. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and timidly asked if they should break off the engagement right now. The Duke stood there in bewilderment, looking at the young lady, as he had not at all expected her to say something like that. She said that now that she had left the family, all promises were no longer valid, and now he had a way to destroy the monsters without the help of the Empire. The Duke timidly said that this was true. He looked at her intently and said that first, he needed to find out the effectiveness of this method, and he had to play it safe and be sure of everything. The young lady, in turn, looked intently at the Duke. She knew that he had openly challenged her family and was now unlikely to receive any support from them. She sighed heavily and said that she understood him. A moment later, she asked if it would be okay if the monsters' numbers decreased, knowing that when the monsters' numbers decreased, then they would talk about breaking off the engagement. The Duke shouted furiously at his subordinates. The Duke looked at the young people in surprise and asked what Duke Rastier was doing. He shouted that it was a kidnapping. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if he was taking her away by force. Psyche looked at everyone intently and said that she was leaving of her own free will. The Duke was furious and couldn't understand how this had happened at all. He couldn't understand when everything had gone wrong, since he had even acknowledged her as his daughter in front of everyone. The Duke, in turn, knew that the young lady had to live quietly and peacefully in their house, obeying them. Izara entered his father's office and asked if he had called him. The Duke handed the young man a piece of paper with blood on it. He told him to pass it on, and he also said that the young man should understand for himself what was there. Izar said that he understood everything and would leave his father alone. Izar wondered if this was a secret message to the Emperor. He did not know if it was connected with Psyche's departure. He did not understand why their father continued to care for the young lady. He looked intently at his master and asked for forgiveness for interfering in something that was none of his business. He asked the gentleman if he had become close to the young lady. The Duke looked at his subordinate in bewilderment and asked what he was saying. Isolette, in turn, made the following conclusion based on recent events. The Duke began to meet the young lady very often, and he was sure that the Duke had fallen in love with her. Isolette knew that the Duke had left, and he immediately agreed to escort her home. Although he could have simply provided her with a carriage, and he came back with the young lady to the mansion with her things. Isolette, in turn, knew that he didn't care whether the Duke had fallen in love or not. The Duke looked at his assistant in surprise and asked if he really had nothing better to do. The young man looked at the Duke in bewilderment and asked why he was getting closer to the young lady if he had decided to end the marriage. Isolette looked at the Duke in surprise and said that this simply could not be, that he was unrequitedly in love. The Duke looked at his assistant with fury. A moment later, he sighed heavily and said that the young man was really annoying him. The Duke understood that the young lady had no idea about it, and if she had found out about it, she would not have stayed in the estate. But in turn, he was very puzzled, because her reaction in the magical association was very strange. Now he could guess what kind of power Leah was talking about then, but he still wondered why the young lady reacted like that. He did not understand why she was afraid of her power and hid it. He knew that Duke Sulpicius's behavior was very strange, but he still wondered why he kept her at home. A moment later, the Duke was informed that the physician had arrived. The Duke knew that the young lady had said that she would leave immediately as soon as she felt better. He understood that no matter how sick she got, she would not leave. The Duke looked at the assistant and asked what the girl might like. The assistant looked at the Duke in surprise, as he did not expect to hear something like that. The young lady sat and slowly read the note from her knight. She was surprised, as her brothers said that they had driven him away, but nevertheless, he had time to leave her a note in her room. She sighed heavily as she realized that their meeting was still on. A moment later, she heard someone knocking on her room door. The Duke walked slowly into the room and told the young lady that he had brought a doctor to her. The doctor smiled, looking at the young lady, and said that it was a great honor for him to meet her. The young lady, in turn, politely greeted him. The doctor said that he had heard that she was seriously ill with something. He asked if he could examine her. Psyche looked at the Duke in surprise, as she thought that he would simply give her a room, but everything turned out to be much more serious. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and said that he would not charge any fee, so she would just have to let the doctor examine her. The young lady, in turn, wondered if this was a hint for her to get well soon and go away. The Duke said that if she was uncomfortable, he could go out. Psyche said that everything was fine, and he could stay looking at the doctor. She said that sometimes she had headaches. She knew that everyone said that she was fooling around, but they couldn't understand her. The doctor frowned for a moment as he looked at the young lady. Then he looked at the Duke and said that they seemed to have symptoms. The doctor asked the Duke if they had anything in common. The Duke was surprised, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. The doctor said that he felt that the young lady had the same accumulation inside her body as the Duke. They just had a foreign admixture in their words. The Duke thought for a moment, as he knew that they couldn't have a similar illness since his symptoms were due to medication, and the young lady's family's abilities did not harm the host, so he knew that there was no need to suppress it. The doctor looked at the young lady and asked if she had taken any medicine. The lady said she had not taken anything. A moment later, she was taken aback. Then what did she remember? She said that she was brought tea every morning, which her brother made. The doctor looked at her and asked how long she had been drinking it, since he needed to know the period the young lady thought about it, and said that she had been taking it for about 10 years. The Duke realized that he was deliberately suppressing her abilities. The Duke understood that, judging by the reaction, Duke Sulpicia and Izar knew about everything and did everything on purpose. The young lady looked at the doctor intently and said that it was very strange, because when her headaches began, she took tea and the pain gradually subsided. The Duke looked at the young lady with a frown, knowing that when the power awakens, the body resists foreign stimuli. For this reason, the young lady experienced pain, and in the process, she adapted to this medicine. The Duke was shocked and wondered how long the young lady had been in the dark. He didn't know if he could tell her about it. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise, as she did not understand why he was so worried. He looked at her intently and asked if she knew what her family's power was. She looked at him in confusion and asked if it was eternal ice. She looked at her and asked if she knew about it, or if she was just pretending not to know. The young lady looked at the Duke in confusion and asked what he was talking about. He was shocked, wondering if she really didn't know anything. He understood that she had seen her abilities, but if the abilities had appeared recently, she didn't seem to understand it and must be unaware. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he didn't even know where to start, but he had recently learned about it at the auction house. A moment later, a bird knocked on their window, and the young people looked at the raven in bewilderment. The Duke looked at the bird intently and told it to wait. He did not understand what all the rush was about. A moment later, the raven signaled to the Lord, and the Duke froze in shock. He looked at the raven and asked if the Duke of Silkesia was really from the imperial family. The Duke looked at the young lady and, asking for forgiveness, said that she must be very tired. He said that it would still be better for her to go to bed early. The young lady looked at him intently, but still agreed. The Duke looked at the doctor and told him to examine her carefully and prescribe her treatment. The doctor obediently agreed. Some time later, the young lady quietly and peacefully went to bed, but the unfamiliar room did not give her peace. She felt uncomfortable because it was unusual. She remembered the post raven and thought for a moment as she had seen it somewhere before. A moment later, she heard a knock on the door. She was surprised because she didn't know who was there. The doctor came into the room and apologized for disturbing the young lady. He said he thought she was already up. He showed her the medicine and said that if she takes it once a day for a month, all the toxins will leave her body. She asked in surprise if the headaches would go away too. The doctor smiled, looking at the young lady, and said that all her pain would go away. The young lady took the pill with disbelief and drank it. She froze for a moment as she was very surprised. She couldn't understand what he meant by the impurity back then, but now she felt as if her body had come to life. The young lady was amazed and very surprised, as she had not felt so well for a long time. The doctor asked the young lady with a smile how she was feeling. She sighed with relief and said that she felt much better. The young lady knew that they had agreed that she would not leave until she recovered, but now she thought that she could leave. The young man looked at the young lady with bewilderment and said that this was not possible. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked why. He said timidly and puzzled that he couldn't tell her, but in turn he knew that it was because he had been up all night, because of the Duke's order to make a list of everything that the girls might like, and now the lady who was supposed to get it all had decided to just up and leave. He understood that he had no authority to stop her, although the Duke denied everything. He was in love with the young lady. The Duke looked at his subordinate and said that he had urgent business, and while he was gone, he should look after the lady. The young man said that he would help her find a place to stay, since the Duke insisted on it. The young man understood that the Duke had given orders to take care of the young lady, and he should not let her go now. Psyche looked at the young man in surprise and asked if he was okay. Isolette, breathing heavily, looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about, but a moment later he said that he was fine. The young lady looked at him intently and said that he seemed very tired. A moment later, she suggested that he sit somewhere in a cafe and take a short break. Psyche sighed heavily. She was puzzled because she didn't think it would be so difficult to find a free seat. He smiled and said that it was just that even foreign ambassadors had arrived for the prince's birthday ceremony. But in turn, he knew that it was very good. And fortunately for him, everything worked out so well. The young lady looked at him sharply and said that they could check a couple more houses and then come back. A moment later, they heard someone talking. Isolette was a little puzzled, as the staff had told him that no sound would leak to them. The young lady in turn became wary as she recognized the voice. A moment later, she listened closely and realized that it was Lady Lily and Hilvia talking Esland. Hilvia told her companion that no one would hear them either, as there was a sound-muffling magic cast, so she could speak freely. She asked what had happened to Lady Psyche. The young people froze in bewilderment. The young lady looked at her companion and gestured to him to be quiet. Lily, in turn, sighed heavily and said that the young lady had left home. Hilvia was shocked and asked how this could happen. Lilia sighed heavily, and with tears in her eyes, she said that the day before she hid from the guards and ran away. A moment later, she said that the young lady, as soon as she returned, began to be rude to her family, who were so worried about her. Lily said that after this incident, she left the house and her father was very shocked and fell ill, and the brothers rushed in a hurry to look for the young lady. Psyche noticed that the girl did not say anything about Duke Restair. Hilvia asked in a rage if the young lady understood what she was doing. She did not understand why the Duke kept her in his house. Lily hesitated and said that she was not sure, but it seemed that she was not as good as Psyche. The young lady looked at Lily in surprise and asked what she was saying. She shouted that Psyche was just a fake and was deceiving everyone, and as soon as her true identity was revealed, everything would fall into place. She shouted that she would definitely help Lily. Psyche sighed heavily as she now understood how rumors really spread. The young man looked at the young lady intently and told her not to worry about it, as he would not tell the Duke. The young lady looked at him in surprise, but said it was fine. She knew she had already fled the house, and now, no matter what damage to her reputation, Hilvia asked if there were any green-eyed men around their age among the people in the estate. Lily looked at her companion in surprise and said that, as far as she knew, there were no such person in the average relative. She asked the lady why she was asking. Hilvia said that she had seen him somewhere, and he looked very similar to a member of their family. Hilvia said that she just heard about the incident with Leas, so she decided to check, just in case Lily asked in surprise who it was. The young lady looked at her companion in surprise and asked if she really didn't know. Lily looked at her companion with surprise and alarm and asked what was wrong. Hilvia hesitated, not knowing how to answer fertilizers. Later, she said that the incident was related to the necklace. She said that the emperor had restored the family's rights as his distant relatives, and nothing more was known. Psyche listened intently to their conversation. Lilia looked at her companion in surprise and asked if there was anything else. Hilvia said that the story itself was real. She looked at Lady Lily and said that she would tell her everything as it was, and she hoped that they would not have any misunderstandings. She was just surprised that the daughter of the Silkia family did not know about this. She said that Silkesia is the family previously mentioned Leas. The young lady in turn was shocked, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She sighed heavily and said that she had no idea about it. She was puzzled and said that it was the first time she had heard of it, but still wondered why no one had told her about it before. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was not surprising because the story was very terrible, and even the imperial family did not remember it. Hilvia said that whatever the reasons pardoning the criminal was a very controversial decision, and there were many assumptions, and the truth was hidden. She sighed heavily and said that she did not know, but perhaps His Majesty did the right thing. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she understood everything, and also thanked her companion for telling her everything. She looked at the young lady and asked if she knew what happened to the necklace. She wanted to know if it was with the imperial family. Hilvia said that as far as she knew, the necklace was stolen, so it was listed as missing. Lily sighed heavily and said that it was very unfortunate, as she wanted to look at him. Psyche thought for a moment as she realized that the lady of the necklace was more interested in than that incident. She wondered if everything that happened to her then was the work of the young lady. Lily asked her companion if she knew who had stolen it. Hilvia said that the young lady seemed very interested, but a moment later they noticed that the device that was muffling them was not working. Psyche looked at her companion and said that they could come at any time and check if anyone had heard them or not, so it was time for them to leave. The young man looked at the young lady intently and said that it was too late to look for an inn, and he was sure that everything was taken, so he asked her to return to the mansion. The young lady in turn agreed, although she felt awkward imposing herself on the Duke. Isolette smiled and said that it was not so at all, and she should make herself at home. He said that he would call a carriage. Now the young lady said that there was no need for that, as she had some business to attend to, so he had to return alone. The young man was surprised, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. The young lady stood waiting for her friend, but seeing that he was nowhere to be seen, she wondered if something had happened to him. She wanted to wait for him a little longer. For a moment, she thought about what had happened. Isolette looked at the young lady closely and asked if she saw how hard he was trying. He asked if she could put in a few good words for the Duke for him. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment, but still agreed. But in turn, she wondered if the Duke really treated his subordinates that badly. The young lady in turn was waiting for her companion, but he was not there. A moment later, she looked back because she heard someone's steps. She realized that they were not human. She wondered if she had taken a weapon with her. A moment later, she realized that the threat was approaching her. A few minutes later, she struck. A moment later, a strange and very frightening picture appeared before her. She saw wolves coming towards her. She looked at them in surprise and wondered if they were monsters. A moment later, the monster pounced on the young lady. She was confused, as her dagger was very small. The monster hit her, but turning around, she froze, as she did not understand where the monster had gone. She wondered if she should leave or wait for her knight. She was worried and hoped that he was not hurt, but in turn, she wondered if he had set it all up. A moment later, she froze in place as she saw the monsters approaching her. She didn't understand what was happening. Psyche was shocked as she saw more and more monsters rising. She realized that these monsters were artificially created by alchemists. She looked at them closely and saw that they were very strong due to their aura. She saw that they were gradually surrounding her. Unfortunately, she did not feel anyone's presence, and with a dagger, she would not have been able to deal with them. She wondered if she would be able to use her power. She was also confused and wondered what would happen if someone came. But still, she knew that she simply had no other choice. She knew that she absolutely had to survive. Moments later, she fell to the ground and screamed in rage. She was in shock because she realized that she couldn't control her own power. She saw that she was slowly starting to freeze and wondered if she would really die like this. But a moment later, the dome of her power collapsed. She heard someone calling her and turned around. She was surprised because she saw the Duke rushing towards her and calling her. She was surprised she didn't expect to see the Duke. He came closer to her and asked if she was okay. The young lady in turn knew that she was not well, as traces of her family's curse remained, and she was told not to forget that if anyone found out about her curse, either they would die or she would. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise. He was alarmed because she was trembling with fear. He looked around in bewilderment and asked if this was possible. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment. She was very scared because she did not understand what he was talking about. Aiden ran up to them and called out to the young lady. He was breathing heavily, asking if she was okay. He wanted to know if she was hurt anywhere. The Duke looked at the young man with fury and told him not to come any closer. A moment later, the Duke pointed his sword at the young man. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise and called out to him. She was excited and did not know whether they saw her or not. The Duke looked sideways at the young lady and told her not to worry, as the young man did not notice anything. The young lady in turn froze in shock, but did not answer, and she noticed that the ice floes had melted and the tracks had disappeared. But a moment later, a crowd of people ran up to them, and looking around in bewilderment, asked what had happened. Someone said that they had seen a huge fire. The Duke sighed heavily, looking at everyone present, and said that people were already crowding. He said that he would definitely deal with a couple of monsters, so they could wait for him on the spot. The young man looked intently at the Duke, but said nothing. A moment later, he came closer to the young lady and asked her forgiveness. He said that while he was waiting for her, he stepped away for a second on business. The young lady in turn looked closely at the knight and realized that he really had not seen anything. She said that he was not guilty and everything was fine. Aiden looked at the young lady and said that on the way back, some strange curtain appeared, and he was late. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked what he was talking about. The young man said he saw the Duke remove the curtain. Aiden looked at the young lady and said that from what he heard, it was forbidden magic. Psyche froze in shock. Forbidden magic was erased from the pages of history for its cruelty, disregard for life, and terrible side effects. And yet there remained something that turned animals into horrible monsters. She knew that the past ones were true monsters, not like the brutalized beasts. She was shocked and wondered how he knew about the forbidden magic. She didn't know how much she could trust him. The young man looked closely at the young lady and timidly asked if she was hurt anywhere. A moment later, the Duke came up to them and angrily told the young man not to come any closer. The Duke asked if his words meant nothing to the knight. The Duke approached the young lady and asked if this was the knight she had spoken of. She said that it was so, and asked if he knew him. The Duke looked at the young man intently and said that he did not know what was in his mind, but he should not bother the young lady and would be better off running after the heir of the family. The young man sighed heavily and said that he did not share the views of their family. The Duke looked at him with a grin and asked how he could trust him. The young lady in turn understood that the young people were representatives of two different factions, and the relationship between them was certainly tense. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and said that it was time for them to go. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked what he was talking about. The Duke said that the hand should be treated before it got worse. Psyche looked at her wound in surprise, as she had completely forgotten about it. She said that it was fine, and it was just a scratch. A moment later, the Duke picked up the young lady and said that the poison monsters cause paralysis, but the effect manifests itself over time. A moment later, she felt her body go numb a little. A few minutes later, a knight ran up to them, and turning to the Duke, said that they had received a report of flame and were asked to write a report of what had happened. The Duke said that the knight could describe the situation and compensate only for the repair costs. The young man looked at the Duke in surprise and said that the reason was the destroyed wall. The Duke looked at him and said that he could write that he was simply bored. The young lady looked at him in surprise and wondered if he was hiding the reason for using his power and was going to pretend that the monster attack didn't happen. She was of course grateful to him, but still something was troubling her. She looked at him intently and timidly said that she could go on her own and asked him to let her go. The Duke said that they intended to let her go, as she felt fine, not because of the weakness of the poison, but because her powers had been activated to neutralize its effect. He looked at her in surprise as he didn't understand what her reaction was a moment later. Looking at the young lady, he said what he wanted to tell her earlier. He understood when he saw her fighting at the auction. The young lady was in shock. She didn't know what to do because she understood that she was caught. She was scared. She looked at him and asked if he would kill her. The Duke froze, looking at the young lady. He was in shock. A moment later, he asked what she was talking about now. The young lady told him to let her go immediately. The Duke was alarmed by her behavior. He said that he needed her to calm down first. A moment later, she pushed him away. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise and called her. He saw that she was trembling with fear. He said that first she needed to be healed, and then they would talk. He said that they knew what happened to her, but he had no intention of harming her. He said that they needed to return to the estate. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and asked what he would do with her now. The Duke sighed heavily and calmly said that he had not thought about it. He said that he would give it back. On the contrary, he wanted to ask her for help. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. The Duke thought for a moment, but a few minutes later, he said that he, unfortunately, could not control his powers as he wanted. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The Duke said that he didn't know if she was familiar with this story, but the history textbook had this text. For unprepared people, God's gift is akin to a curse. Rastir could not control his powers and slowly burned. If not for Silkesia, he would certainly have turned into flames. The Duke said that this did not happen since his flame is not under the control of an ordinary human body. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment and asked what she had to do with it. He said he needed her help to control the powers. He looked at her intently and said that her strength was like unmelting ice. The young lady froze in place from shock. She could not believe what she heard. She thought he was wrong because if he knew she was cursed, he would have killed her. She didn't want that and knew that it wasn't right. If she didn't resolve the misunderstanding, now everything could end badly. The Duke looked at the young lady with puzzlement and called her. He asked if she was okay, as he could see from her worried look. She knew that he had revealed his weakness to her, thinking that the ice that did not melt was her strength, but she did not want to use it at all. Sighing heavily, the young lady said that the ice that did not melt was not her strength, and he should know that she was adopted. She looked at him hard and said she was cursed. She realized that she had told him everything, and all she could do was wait for his verdict. She was puzzled and excited, because she didn't know what would happen next. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she thought it was a curse. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was really going to ask again. Psyche said that it was a very dangerous and uncontrollable force. The Duke looked calmly at the young lady and said that his flame was like that too. The young lady was sure of the opposite. She said that his power was different. A moment later, she started to panic and said she was cursed. She kept repeating it. A moment later, the Duke pulled her towards him. Psyche looked at him in surprise. He looked at her with fury and said that she was starting to piss him off. A moment later, looking at the young lady, he told her to listen to him, as she really did have ice that would not melt. She froze, not knowing what to say to him, because she didn't believe what he was saying. He looked at her intently and asked if she knew about the incident with the poisoned necklace that happened 20 years ago. The Duke said that the instigators of that incident were the House of Silkesia, but the current representatives of the family are not direct descendants. He looked at her closely and said that he believed she was the daughter of Rheas, a direct surviving descendant. The young lady was shocked. She looked at the Duke and shouted that this simply could not be. The Duke said that he did not just think so, but he was sure of it. Since this is confirmed by the reaction of his flame to her energy, he said that the only thing that responds to the restless flame of the Resteurs in this way is the unquenchable ice of Silkia. The young lady did not understand what he was saying. She thought that it simply could not be, but still she understood that the Duke had no reason to lie to her. She froze in shock because she understood his words, but in turn she simply could not believe it. A moment later, unable to bear the load, she collapsed to the ground and the Duke managed to catch the young lady. The young lady was puzzled because she knew she was talking to someone well. She couldn't understand where she was. She was asked her name, but she couldn't answer. She almost raised her head in front of the gentleman. She knew she had to answer. She knew that because of the curse, she would certainly be abandoned, but she did not know what to do since she had not even eaten anything today. Without raising her head, she said that they remembered her name. The man said with fury that this was just nonsense. She knew that she could not cry since she hated tears. The man looked at the little girl intently and told her to raise her head immediately, that no one but him had come to look at the damned young girl. He looked at her intently and said that she had powers, and if she was exposed, then everyone would die. She knew that the curse gave her powers, but if she was exposed, then they would certainly kill her. She looked at the man with fear and asked what she should do with tears in her eyes. She said that she would do whatever he ordered. The man looked at her intently and said that her name was Psyche. The little girl looked at the man in surprise. The man in turn said that this was her name. Now she was surprised because she was given a name. He looked at her intently and told her to remember him, because no one but Silkesia could have what she would have. The young lady looked at the man intently as she knew him. A moment later, she heard the Duke's voice and was taken aback. The Duke sighed in confusion and asked if he really had to start over. She was in shock and did not understand how it happened that the Duke was in front of her. She wondered if he personally brought her here. He looked at her intently and asked if you were repeating the same thing to him for the 10th time. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked what he was talking about. The Duke said that he had told her about the powers of unmelting ice. He said that perhaps he should start with the fact that his powers were out of control. The young lady looked at him puzzled and said it was a misunderstanding, sighed heavily, and said that he knew what she wanted to say, but he asked her to listen to him. After the story, the young lady looked intently at the Duke and said that he was definitely mistaken, since such a thing simply could not happen. The Duke in turn said that it was not so, but a moment later he sighed heavily and said that they could stop there today. He would very much like to know what happened. Without repeating the story, he knew that when it came to the young lady's powers, or her origin, she said that she had heard such things, but unfortunately she did not admit anything. He knew that soon she would say that in general, she had not heard anything. He learned that excessive efforts can break a person. He did not know what to do. Psyche looked intently at the Duke and called him. The Duke in turn said that they could talk later. He said that today had been a hard day. He looked at her intently and said that for now they had better stop there, but the young lady in turn wanted to object. The Duke said that she didn't need to think about anything else and that it would be better for her to rest. He said that she had been treated after all, but that she needed to be more careful. The young lady in turn was perplexed and did not understand what the Duke was talking about. She knew that he had revealed his weaknesses to her and had repeated the story about strength several times. She in turn wondered what it was that I did not. Later she realized that she was getting sleepy. She knew that this had happened before and that soon everything would pass. A moment later, she collapsed onto the bed. The young lady in turn was very tired, and even moving from the spot was problematic for her. She knew that her curse had been revealed, and she needed to leave the estate quickly. She knew that she needed to run as fast as possible. The young lady slapped her hands hard, looking at the man, and saying that they had missed a good opportunity. She asked if there were any more victims. They stared at the wolf who was in the center of the circle. The young man sighed heavily, and looking at the young lady, he said that he would try to find new ones. She looked at the young man intently and told him to hurry immediately, as it would be late. She said that unfortunately, the Duke had seen the monsters. The young man looked at her in surprise and asked if Duke Rastir had seen their monsters. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was nothing to worry about. They needed to catch Hiles, as he was interfering with her research. But she was puzzled that outsiders had seen her experiment. She said that Lady Psyche had dealt with the monsters with her ice. She wondered if it was because of the late manifestation of power. A moment later, she looked at her companion in shock as he grabbed her by the neck with lightning speed. The young man looked at the young lady with rage and asked if the Duke had seen her. She was excited and did not understand what he was talking about. He asked if the Duke had seen her abilities. She said that maybe he had. She screamed that she was in pain and asked the young man to let her go. He looked at her with fury and said that not only did her monsters put Lady Psyche in danger, but the Duke also saw her abilities. The young lady screamed that she did not do it on purpose and also asked to let her go. She looked closely at her companion and said that it turned out that the Duke had known about her power. From the start, she said that he was not surprised, but rather tried to hide what he knew. She screamed that it was not her fault. The young man looked at her intently, but said nothing. He remembered when the Duke told him that a letter had arrived from the other side. He said that he would certainly take care of the child. The young man was furious because the Duke had not kept his word. The young lady looked at him intently and said that since that was the case, she asked him if he wanted to start with the circles of eternal life. She said that the more often the blood was used, the greater the intelligence and the higher the efficiency. She looked at the young man intently and told him to just prepare the material for her. She would certainly sort out the idiot's mistakes. Psyche woke up and wondered how she had fallen asleep. She remembered what had happened yesterday in great detail. She knew that the Duke had revealed her curse, but the young lady in turn was puzzled and did not know what to do. Now she knew that it was useless for her to run away. Because of the ring, she knew that until the Duke changed his mind, she needed to break off the engagement and run away. She would not be able to prove that her guesses worked against the monsters in the north. The maid looked at the lady intently and said that she would go straight away and prepare some water for her and also serve her breakfast. The young lady was surprised, for the Duke's servants were very polite to her, but she wondered if this was too much for her. A moment later, she heard a knock on the door. She was surprised because she thought that the maid had run to her very quickly. Iseult asked the young lady for forgiveness. He asked if she was awake. He also wanted to know how she was feeling, and if he needed to call a doctor. The young lady in turn said that there was no need for this, as she had been greatly helped yesterday, and also thanked him for his concern. He looked at her intently and said that he should have waited for her until the end, and also offered her his apologies. The young man said that monsters in the capital itself were simply unimaginable. She looked at him intently and asked if they were really unusual. The monsters they spoke of were natural entities, but the ones that attacked them were degenerates created by forbidden magic. The young man thought for a moment and said that he seemed to have gotten it wrong. The young lady said that it was okay, since he was more used to simple monsters. He sighed heavily and said that he was very glad that she had not been harmed by the sudden appearance of the creature. But if the Duke had not gone after her, she could have been harmed. The young lady looked at the young man in surprise and wondered if the Duke had passed by. The young man said that the Duke in turn had scolded him very much for leaving her alone. So now he was obliged to look after her, or she had to take guards with her. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she understood. She raised that there might be trouble when leaving the estate. She was puzzled because she didn't want to have trouble at all. She thought that she needed to get out of the estate soon. The young man looked intently at the young lady and timidly said that he needed advice. She looked at him intently and said she was listening. A moment later, the maid came to the young lady with a smile and said that she had brought her breakfast. The maid told the young lady that if she was not particularly hungry, she could at least have something light. The maid said that she would cook whatever she liked for dinner, and she could only say the young lady in turn wondered what she liked. The young man looked at the young lady intently and said that she needed to know what girls her age liked. He said that he had to buy a gift, and that was why he was seeking her advice. The young lady sighed heavily and said that unfortunately, she would not be able to help him. For a moment she wondered what she liked. She knew that he wore the clothes of a real lady and did everything to be recognized as a lady. She knew that she should like what her family members liked. But she was still worried and wondered what exactly she liked. The maid looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that if she was not drawn to anything, she could at least drink coffee, since it was a special coffee from their chef. The young lady agreed and slowly tasted the drink. She felt the warmth that spread throughout her body. She was surprised as it was very tasty. She felt that her body was filled with energy. The maid looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that it was good that she liked it, and she would pass on her words to the cook, and next time he would make her more coffee. The young lady looked at the maid intently and thanked her with a smile on her face. Psyche was surprised because for the first time she liked something. She knew that she was already feeling better, and she knew that tomorrow she needed to go to the Magic Association. She wanted to find out how things were going with the fight against monsters. A moment later, she saw Leah screaming near the door. Leah looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was doing there. Psyche looked at her with a smile and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. Psyche said that she was just away on business for a short time. Leah looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was talking about. A moment later, she began to circle around the young lady and ask where it hurt. Psyche looked at her puzzledly and timidly said that she was fine and feeling better. Leah in turn was shocked as she saw that the young lady's entire body was mutilated. A moment later, the Duke came out into the corridor, surprised that she had not yet left. A moment later, he saw her, but her lady, and asked if she was okay. Leah looked angrily at the Duke. A moment later, she took the young lady by the hand and told her to go with her. Psyche looked at her in surprise, but did not have time to utter a word. The Duke in turn shouted for them to wait. Leah shouted to the Duke that she would be right back, and he should wait for her in the study. The young lady looked at her in surprise and said that she should wait a little. Leah apologized to the young lady for dragging her outside, but she did not want to speak in front of the Duke. Psyche looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Leah looked closely at the young lady and asked excitedly if the Duke had threatened her. She asked if she had revealed her weakness to the Duke. The young lady looked at her in surprise and asked what she meant by that. Leah asked why she was walking around here. Then the young lady sighed heavily and said that she had her own circumstances. Leah asked how things were at home. The young lady sighed heavily and said that everything was fine at home. Psyche knew that they were not even married yet, and living together was problematic, and it all seemed very strange to her, since being involved with a person you don't know is very difficult. Leah sighed heavily and said that she understood everything, and also asked if the lady could help her. Leah looked at the raven with fury and asked if he really thought that, because he looked like his master, he could shout like that. She said that if he was guarding the lady, he should behave more quietly and do what he was told. The young lady in turn looked at the raven in surprise. Psyche looked closely at the raven, as she thought it was not the same raven that had visited the Duke the last time, as she noticed that the color of the eyes was different. Leah looked at the young lady intently and said that she knew the raven and he wouldn't, but they shouldn't pay attention to him and should go. The young lady looked at her companion in surprise and asked where they should go. Leah looked at the young lady and asked if she had encountered forbidden magic last night. She said that in order to catch the culprits, they had to go to the scene first. The young lady looked at her companion in surprise and asked if this was possible. Leah said that forbidden magic is still magic, so they are tracked the same way. After a while, they came to the scene of the incident. Leah sighed heavily and said that the view here was worse than she thought. Leah looked at the young lady and said that if anything started, she needed to shake her, since she didn't notice anything while concentrating. The young men looked at the young ladies in surprise, as they did not understand what they were doing there. Moments later, everyone started whispering and talking about the Duke destroying the wall, and they also started discussing the relationship between the Duke and the young lady. The young lady, in turn, knew that information about the appearance of monsters was very well controlled, and everyone only heard that the Duke destroyed the wall next to his bride's house. The young lady, in turn, was grateful that such stories had spread, since she realized that, judging by the atmosphere, the rumor of her leaving home had not yet spread. She knew that the Duke and her brother cared about the family's reputation and would keep this situation under wraps. But she also knew that Lilia had already started talking about her leaving home. Lennox looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was doing there. She didn't expect to see him. He looked at her with fury and asked her again what she was doing. He asked if she had really stormed out of the house and was now ashamed to come back. He asked if she was really waiting to be taken back. She looked at him intently but said nothing. He looked at the young lady with a smirk and asked if things weren't going well with her and the Duke, and with a haughty smirk, he asked who would ever like her. The young man looked at her with contempt and said that he still felt sorry for her, and he already knew that she would later quietly crawl back to the nest. Psyche looked at him intently and told him to leave her alone. He looked at her with fury and asked what she was talking about. Psyche turned around and said that she did not need his help at all. Lennox looked at her with fury. The young lady in turn knew that the young man had an unbearable character. She in turn could not even imagine how the situation could now turn out. The young lady looked at the raven intently and told him to be quiet and not to interfere. She asked him to pretend he didn't see anything. She knew the situation could turn in her favor. A moment later, the young man grabbed the young lady by the shoulder and turned her towards him. But a few minutes later, he slapped her furiously on the cheek. The young lady in turn realized that his blow was clumsy, and it could be considered that he did not even hit. She thought that he would have to be provoked more. But her refusal made him explode. She thought that the past had hardened her after all. A moment later, everyone looked at the young people. They were shocked that a young man had hit a young lady right in the middle of the street. The young lady looked at him with a smirk and said that he was a good boy. The young man looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about a moment later. She angrily slapped him on the cheek. Lennox was shocked as he didn't expect this. She looked at him with fury and contempt and told him to stop poking her. He looked at her with anger and asked how she dared to raise her hand to him. He shouted that she was a crazy witch. After his words, the young lady hit him again with fury. She looked at him with disdain and told him not to dare swear. The young man froze in surprise, as he did not expect such a thing. He could not utter a word. A moment later, the young lady grabbed his arm tightly. He looked at her with fury and shouted for her to let go at once. He looked at the knights and shouted for them to drag her away alive. The young lady came closer to him and quietly whispered that it seemed he still did not understand anything. She said with disdain that for them, her position was higher than his. Since everyone saw that he raised his hand to her, first she asked what he would do now. Lennox pushed her away angrily. He wanted to hit her again, but the young lady managed to trip him up, and he fell to the ground with a crash. She looked at him with contempt because she realized that he still had not put all the facts together. She knew that such a fight would be a disgrace to the whole family. She saw that people had gathered around and were starting to whisper. They were discussing everything that had happened. The young lady, in turn, understood that rumors spread very quickly. The young man looked at the knights and shouted at them not to look, but to grab her immediately. He shouted that he would not just leave her with what she had done to him. The young lady, in turn, understood that it was simply useless to explain anything to him. He looked at her with fury and asked if she really thought she would get away with it. He shouted at her not to even dare to enter the house. He continued to shout at the young lady, but suddenly magic enveloped him, and he fell silent. Leah came closer to them and asked with disdain who was howling like that. She said that her head was splitting from the screaming. The young lady looked at her in surprise, as she knew that Leah's magic was of the freezing type. She did not understand whose plant it was. A moment later, the young lady walked up to them and said with a smirk that she was confused and didn't know who was making such a noise near the great family's house. She said with a smirk that it seemed like the middle son was causing trouble. She looked at them intently and said with a grin that she had heard that the middle son of a large family was very intelligent, but she had not expected this at all. Psyche looked at the young lady in surprise and asked who she was. She looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that her name was Siona Tuberos, and she was very pleased to meet her. Leah looked at her with fury and told her not to dare to come closer and quickly left. Siona did not obey the young lady. Leah said angrily that they were leaving. Siona smiled and said with a smile that they would meet soon. Leah was furious as she knew that this was simply unheard of. She did not understand that Siona had forgotten here. Again, the young lady looked at her companion in surprise and asked if she really knew her. Leah said angrily that there was no need for such knowledge. She said that everything was very complicated. Leah looked at the raven with fury and asked what he was doing. She said that since he had become a guard, he needed to be guarded. The young lady, in turn, timidly said that she had asked him not to interfere, as she needed to receive a few blows. Leah looked at her with fury and asked what she was talking about, because if she had not come on time, everything could have turned out completely differently. The young lady looked at her companion and said with a smile that she was fine, and also asked how the investigation went. Leah sighed heavily and said that the results were a bit ambiguous. Psyche was surprised by such an answer. Leah didn't know how to explain everything to Psyche. She said that magic leaves behind an energy trace, but it didn't seem to be used by a human. The young lady asked in surprise if that was really possible. Leah said that she unfortunately didn't know, as she had never encountered anything like this before and needed to do some research. Leah looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what happened. Psyche asked, puzzled if there was any chance that they were deliberately hunting her. Leah said that she unfortunately did not know. She wondered if someone really hated her that much, since she knew that, after all, it was not the kind of magic that anyone could use. The young lady, in turn, wondered for a moment who could hate her so much, but she knew that her family had simpler means against her. Psyche said that the man she was going to meet that day said that on the way to the appointed place, he noticed some kind of curtain. Leah said that there were some traces, but they were not connected with either her or the Duke. She asked the lady who she was going to meet. Psyche said that she was going to meet the knight who was her former guard. A moment later, she froze in surprise as she saw her companion's expression change. Psyche looked closely at the young lady, as her reaction had not seemed strange to her before. But upon hearing the name of her knight, her expression changed dramatically. She wondered if they knew each other. Leah looked at the young lady with a puzzled expression and apologized, but said that she had to run now, and also asked her to be careful on the way back. The young lady in turn thought for a moment and wondered if the monsters could be hunting her knight specifically. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and asked what she was doing. He asked her, puzzled, why she didn't go inside. He came closer to her and touched her face tenderly. He was furious, and looking at the young lady, asked what was wrong with her face. She froze, not knowing what to answer, as she did not expect such a thing from the Duke. The Duke turned his gaze angrily to the raven and asked how this had happened. The lady looked at the Duke intently and said that the raven had not interfered in her case at her own request. The Duke looked at her intently and told her to explain at once what had happened. Psyche looked at the Duke with embarrassment and asked him to remove his hand first. The Duke was taken aback and sheepishly asked for forgiveness. He said that she had hurt herself, and he had been so worried she sighed heavily and said that she understood everything. The Duke looked at her intently and asked who had done this to her. The young lady, in turn, wanted to change the subject, but she understood that the Duke would not leave the situation so easily. She sighed heavily and said that she and her brother had had a little argument. The Duke was shocked by what he heard. He was furious. He remembered how the young man had treated his bride the last time the Duke had said in a fury that he would break all his bones. The young lady looked at the Duke with puzzlement and said that he had seen this disgrace. The Duke, with tenderness, told the young lady that she should not be embarrassed at all. She said she didn't think it was a big deal. She said she was going to look for a place to live soon, so he should wait a little. The Duke looked at the young lady with fury and asked her in bewilderment why she was bringing up the subject again. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise, as she did not understand his reaction. She wanted to say something, but the Duke interrupted her. The Duke said they could forget the moment, but he still wanted to know what exactly happened. The Duke said that he thought it best to leave some of the conversation for later, and simply put, he found her presence a great help. The young lady in turn froze in place looking at the Duke, as she was surprised that he would say something like that. The Duke knew that the young lady was the only one who could stop the surge of his abilities, but he still wondered if that was all. Looking at the young lady, he knew that it was not. He looked at her intently and said that was not why he wanted to see her here. The Duke thought for a moment, but later said that this was the first time this had happened to him, and he didn't even know how best to say it. He said that, frankly, he was just very worried about her. The Duke smiled and said that it would therefore be good if she were in his sight. He sighed heavily and said that he was not forcing her at all, and if she wanted to leave, she was free to do so at any time. He sighed heavily and said that he would not delay the conclusion of the contract at all if it bothered her very much. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he respected her choice. A moment later, the Duke tenderly took her hand and kissed it. The young lady froze in place with embarrassment. The Duke smiled, looking at his young companion, and said that he did not want her to leave at all, and he decided to tell her what was really on his mind. Leah glared at the Duke and asked him what he was even thinking about bringing the young lady here. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked if she had really come into someone else's office in the morning to make a scandal. She asked him if he was really going to use the young lady. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he had not even thought about it. The Duke, in turn, understood that he had lied a little. He knew that every time the lady's abilities manifested, the uncontrollable flame inside him died down. He knew that perhaps it would be easier if he didn't know about it. He knew it was like dangling a piece of food in front of a starving man. The Duke, in turn, decided that he would not force anyone to fulfill his desires and needs. Leah looked at the Duke with fury and said that he could send the young lady away, as there was nothing good for her reputation here. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she knew what would happen in that case. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment and asked what he meant by that. She looked at him closely after a long story and asked if he was saying that she had been brainwashed. The Duke said that it was so, but unfortunately, he did not know whose handiwork it was, and carelessness could cost them dearly. He knew that if it weren't for this, the young lady could live peacefully on her own. The young lady said that he needed to try to summon the powers in a safe environment. The Duke looked at her intently and said that he understood. She thought for a moment and said that she would also try to look for some information. She said that they also needed to help Aiden. Leah said that she had broken ties with Hilais. The Duke looked at her in surprise and said that he did not believe it. He said that he would like to talk to her frankly, since he did not like Hilais very much, and she, as far as he knew. The young lady, in turn, trained constantly in her free time. She remembered how the Duke, looking at her, said that he was not going to force her to go against her will, and she could do what she wanted and even leave. She knew the Duke was not one to speak twice, and she could have left that day. The Duke looked at her intently and said that at the auction, he had made a promise to fight her once if the opportunity arose. The young lady thought for a moment and thought that she should have refused this opportunity, but even if it was possible to go back a couple of days, she would not be able to refuse. Psyche didn't know when she would get another chance to fight the strongest swordmaster in the entire duchy. She knew that the Duke was the best she had ever seen. He was very strong and perfect. The young lady was shocked, as it was the first time in her life that she had been defeated so easily. She looked at him intently and said that unfortunately she had lost. After her brother, she was second to none in battle. Facing a new wall was unpleasant but very exciting. The young lady looked closely at the Duke and thanked him for the fight. She said it was a useful practice for her. The Duke looked at the young lady closely and said that it was a bit of a pity she looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He said that she had not been properly trained to fight. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked if it was really that noticeable. When she was adopted, she mastered the basics, and fake ladies don't need more than that. She learned by spying on her brother, and when she got better at it, they started avoiding her. The Duke looked at her closely and said that someone weaker than him might not notice. The Duke asked the lady if she wanted to learn from him. The young lady froze in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing. She was a little puzzled, as his proposal was a little out of line. When the Duke said these words, her heart was beating very loudly. She looked at him intently and said that she agreed to study with him. When she agreed, she realized that she really enjoyed disfiguring with a sword. The Duke walked closer to the young lady and asked if she had finished her basic training. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she had just finished. The Duke knew that the task was very difficult, but she was doing well. Of course, he partly wanted to wear her out so that she would not think about leaving. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and asked if they could fight in a few minutes. Psyche looked at him intently and agreed. The Duke, in turn, saw that the young lady was glowing with happiness at the mention of sword fighting. He remembered his companion telling him that he should call upon the forces in a safe environment. The Duke looked at the young lady closely and said that today they could take up real swords. The Duke thought that she had psychological blocks to using abilities. The Duke in turn understood that if all the energy went into battle, then perhaps it would be more difficult for her to suppress the force. He looked closely at the young lady who was preparing for battle. She looked at him in surprise and did not understand what was happening to him. She noticed that he was somehow different today. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and said that he had given it to her with real swords. He would not give in to her. A moment later, they began to fight. The Duke looked at her closely and asked if she could really do that. He said that if she held the sword too loosely in her hand, she could twist her wrists. She knew he was right, but she felt strange. She didn't understand what was happening, since this had never happened before. It seemed to her that the powers of her curse were released every time her and the Duke's swords clashed. After some time, the young lady saw that she was enveloped in light. She froze in place. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and said that this power, which was completely under her control, he said that she needed to concentrate even more. The lady in turn sighed heavily and attacked the Duke with fury. She screamed that she was failing. The Duke looked at her intently and said that she should not try to suppress her strength. She looked at him intently and asked if he really wanted to lose. The Duke knew that, according to the doctor, the substance suppressing her strength should have already dissipated. He thought that soon it would all be a matter of her mood. He was furious since he did not want to go such a cruel way, although he knew that he had never communicated with anyone so gently. The maid looked at the young lady and said that the Duke had gone too far. She was furious and could not understand how one could treat a lady like that. The young lady in turn said that she was fine, and the Duke, on the contrary, was helping her, and the bruise would quickly go away. The maid angrily said that this was not possible, since the Duke had left her with more than just a bruise. She looked at the young lady closely and said that she had applied ointment to her and would also like to give her a massage. The maid said that if she left it like that, her body would hurt. She smiled and thanked the maid for her concern. The maid looked at the young lady closely and said that she needed a good rest, and also said that she had received a letter and some object. Psyche looked at the table in surprise, as she did not expect anything to come to her. The package contained a sample to test the properties and durability of the moonstone, and the letter contained information about a mercenary who could deal with Azum. She remembered that the Duke also said that monsters could be stopped with freezing magic. She knew that the work that had begun during the divorce agreement was coming to an end. If she could get in touch with the mercenary, everything would be very good. She knew that she would have to leave soon. She knew that this was all she could do, and the Duke had said that she could leave him whenever she wanted. The young lady was very sad, as she was tormented by a strange feeling. She thought that once she completely figured it out, she would feel better. The man looked intently at the young lady and politely said that the Duke was waiting for her. The young lady knew that they had only been training lately. She was curious about what had happened. She thought that most likely the news about the package had reached him. Entering the room, the young lady froze in place as she saw so many beautiful things. The Duke looked at her intently and said she could pass. She looked at him in surprise and said she had been told he wanted to see her. She was puzzled and did not understand what was happening. The young lady looked around the room and asked what had happened. The Duke looked at the young lady with a smile and asked if she was interested in anything. He said that if she was interested in anything, she could just choose. The young lady looked at the Duke with indifference and said that she didn't particularly like anything. The Duke was shocked, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. He said that it was all his, and if she needed anything, he could provide it to her. The young lady said that she understood him, but for now there was no need for it. The young man was in shock. He did not understand how one could behave like that without any sense. The young lady looked closely at all the objects that were in the room and realized that they did not look like family heirlooms passed down from generation to generation. She thought that the Duke was carried away by women's clothes and modern fashion. She was the kind of person who in a past life entered into social circles and senses the fashion of the near future. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise and asked why he had called her. The Duke smiled and said that he was going to give her something. He handed her a small box, and she looked at it in bewilderment. The Duke looked at her closely and said with a smile that he would like to give her an old sword that was no longer useful due to the blood of monsters. Psyche sighed heavily and said that her sword had already fallen apart. She looked at the Duke intently and asked what this had to do with the earring. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and told her to take the earring as if holding a sword in her hand and generate mana. The young lady froze in surprise as she saw that her earring had turned into a sword. She had only heard about something like this before, but this was the first time she saw it, and she knew that something like this required the highest rank of magic stones. The young lady looked at the Duke and said that, unfortunately, she could not accept such an expensive thing. The Duke looked at her intently and said with a smile that she simply had no choice. He said that now only she can use this sword. It only reacts to the mana of the first owner. The young lady was shocked as she did not expect such a thing. She realized that she had simply ruined an expensive thing. The Duke looked at her intently and said with a smile that she should not upset him and should just accept the gift. He said that he was tired of cheap training swords. The Duke looked at the young lady closely and said that if she was worried about the cost of this gift, then she could consider it a gift for his first student. The young lady looked at him in surprise. The Duke said that usually the first sword a student receives from his teacher, such is the tradition. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The Duke looked at the young lady with a gentle smile and said that it suited her very well. The young lady smiled and agreed with the Duke. She said that the earring was simply lovely. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise and called him. The Duke was shocked and did not know what he was even saying. He was so embarrassed that he could not raise his eyes to the young lady. The maid looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she had a beautiful earring, and she also said that she had not seen it before. A moment later, she asked with a smile if this was a gift from their Duke. She looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if he had only given one. The young lady said that it was not really an earring. The maid asked if the Duke had given her anything else. The young lady said in surprise that he had not given her anything else. Since they were not in that kind of relationship, the maid asked in bewilderment what kind of relationship they were in since they were engaged. She said that the young lady had little jewelry and clothes. Psyche herself knew this very well, since she had left the house in a hurry and had not taken anything with her, and she had not planned to stay at the estate for long. She knew that, due to the intense frequent training, her clothes wore out and tore very quickly. The young lady looked at the maid and asked if she would like to go shopping with her tomorrow. The maid smiled and said that she would be very happy to go with her. The young lady, in turn, was perplexed, as she did not understand what was going on at all. The maid looked at the Duke and asked if he liked the outfits. The Duke smiled and said that they were not bad, and they could count each option for him. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise. The Duke asked if she didn't like it. Psyche said that it wasn't like that at all, but she had to pay. The young men looked at the young lady intently and said that she was their guest, and she should simply choose whatever she needed. The maid said that the young lady also needed to take a couple of casual and evening outfits. Psyche was shocked and did not expect this. She looked at those present and told them to wait a little. The maid looked closely at the young lady and the Duke and said that while they sorted out their shopping, they could rest a little. After some time, the young lady was sitting with the Duke and drinking tea. Psyche said that she had asked the Duke earlier to contact Knight Aiden. She asked if he had succeeded in doing so. After the incident with the monsters, she had no chance to communicate with him. And after talking with Leah, she was overcome with worry. She thought that the monsters might be hunting the knight. And for this reason, she asked the Duke to contact him. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said that he had spoken to the knight and had conveyed to him the young lady's words that the monsters might also be hunting him. The Duke sighed heavily and, looking at the young lady, said that it would be better if she stopped contacting him, since there was nothing good in connection with Hillis. She said that she knew he didn't like Emperor Hillis. She asked if it was right to judge people by their parents. She remembered her knight telling her that he had renounced his family. The Duke looked at the young lady with bewilderment and asked why she continued to see the knight. He asked if she had any interest in him. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she had said earlier that she had nothing like that. She looked closely at the Duke and asked if he had told her earlier that it did not matter to him whether she had someone else. She asked in bewilderment why he then constantly asked such a question. The Duke was taken aback for a moment, as he did not expect such a question. The young lady froze in place, as she felt that the ring suddenly gave off a feeling of excitement. She wondered if this was the Duke's feeling. She knew that the ring was not lying, as the artifact told her the location and feelings of her partner. She was a little puzzled, as, until this moment, she had never received any impulses about the Duke's feelings. The Duke hesitated, looking at the young lady. In turn, the Duke did not have time to say anything as a man approached them. The man looked at the young people with a smile and told the Duke that this was just a fateful meeting and he had to tell him something. The Duke looked at the man with fury and said that he did not know him and asked him to stop talking nonsense. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and said that she would go away for a few minutes and they could talk for a while as she needed some air. The Duke was shocked because he wanted to continue the conversation, but the young lady did not listen to him. The Duke was a little puzzled as the young lady had gone away. He had called her, but everything was clear. The man looked at the Duke intently and said with a smile that he would not take up much of his time. Psyche looked closely at the ring she had. She didn't understand what had happened at all and why the Duke had felt such a thing. The young lady, in turn, saw people who recognized her. They were whispering to each other as they realized that she was the same fake lady. A moment later, the young lady transformed into her other form. As she was tired of the looks and conversations of strangers, she knew that she would be more comfortable this way. She was very glad that today's clothes suited a man too. A moment later, she saw a notice on the wall and remembered that the festival to celebrate the second prince's birthday was approaching. She knew that it would be impossible to contact the mercenary now, and there was a high probability that she would be able to see him at the festival. She knew she had to go there on the first day and see for herself. The young lady knew that her maid would be near the carriage, and she needed to go there. But a moment later, she accidentally collided with a young lady. The young lady looked at the young man with fury and shouted at him to watch where he was going. Psyche was shocked, as she did not expect to see Lady Hilvia at all. The young lady looked at the young man intently and asked him angrily what he was staring at. Psyche froze in surprise as she saw an envelope with a letter and a familiar seal. Hilvia was furious as everything she was holding in her hands fell apart. Hilvia looked at the young man with fury and said that the girl had fallen in front of him and he was just staring at her. The young lady stood up in a hurry and started walking. She said that he was lucky today as she was busy. Psyche knew that the seal that was on the young lady's letter belonged to Lilia, and there could be no mistake since she used the seal in important correspondence. Psyche was a little puzzled by the young lady's walk through the squalid alleys. She knew she had better follow the young lady. A moment later, she saw a man who was also following the young lady. She noticed that his steps left no traces. A moment later, she heard a scream. The young lady looked at the young men with fury and shouted at them to move away. She asked if they thought they could get away with this. She shouted and asked if they knew who her father was. The man looked at the young lady with a smirk and said that they knew him because he was the same person who did not want to meet them. The man asked with a grin if her father didn't want to see his daughter. The young lady froze in surprise and asked with a trembling voice what he was talking about. A moment later, the man handed her a piece of paper with a grin and said that it said how much her father owed them. The young lady was shocked and said that this simply couldn't be true. She knew that, although her pocket money had been decreasing lately, she couldn't believe what was written. The man looked at the young lady intently and with a smirk told her to sign. Now she was surprised and puzzled, looked at him and asked if he really wanted her to believe that the man said they would hold her until she signed. The young lady in turn said that they would not succeed. A moment later, the young people heard someone's steps. Psyche, standing around the corner, thought that this was some kind of mistake. She knew that, after their conversation, she had to cross paths with the young lady, but if she continued to hide things, would only get more complicated. The man looked at the young man with anger and asked who he was and why he was following them at such an hour. Psyche looked at the man intently and said that she also had some questions, so she was waiting her turn. The young lady looked at the young man with confusion and asked if he had any questions for her. A moment later, she said that they had recently bumped into each other. The man looked at the boy with fury and asked if he knew what they were going to do to her. The man said that his story seemed crazy since he just stood and waited. Psyche looked closely at the young men and said that only two things were decided this way in a black moon, and judging by what was happening, finances were involved. She looked at them intently and said that as far as she understood, they had already finished with the young lady by the time she arrived. The Black Moon is a society of assassins posing as a guild involved in illegal loans. The young lady, in turn, knew that walking without leaving a trace was their special skill, and she also heard about the recent rumors about the financial situation of the young lady's family. She knew that only the Black Moon could deal with them. To be honest, she didn't really want to know about it. But lately, she had been learning a lot of useless information. She sighed heavily and said that it seemed she had already answered their question, looked closely at the man, and asked, since he had already finished his business, if she could finally talk to the young lady. The man looked at his colleague and asked if the signature was confirmed. His colleague said they were done. The man looked sideways at the young man and said they were leaving. A moment later, the young lady ran up to the young man. In a hurry, she asked him if he thought it was too much. She said that poor ladies had to suffer because of such scoundrels. She asked which line he was in. She asked angrily if, since he came to the auction from a noble family, he was allowed to speak like that to a lady. Psyche said that they apparently had different views on what was happening. She said that, in her opinion, the people who were in danger now were the ones who had almost taken over her family's money. She said that it didn't matter to her, but she wanted to know where she got Silkisia's letter from. The young lady looked at the young man in surprise and asked how he knew. Psyche looked at the lady intently and said that it seemed that Lady Lily had paid her well, since a girl from such a noble family was now at her beck and call. The young lady looked at the young man with fury and asked who he was to say such a thing. Psyche said that this secret road leads to the jeweler. Psyche thought that Lily herself was going to make a poisonous necklace, just like in her past life. Psyche looked closely at the young lady and asked if she knew the contents of the letter. The young lady angrily attacked the young man and said that she simply wanted to help her sick friend. The young lady froze in surprise for a moment and came closer to the young man. She was shocked as she saw that the young man had a real tear of the wave. Psyche looked at the young lady and said that she did not understand her. The young lady looked at the young man with charm in her eyes. She said that she heard that she was sold for 50 million gold at a recent private auction, and it was a great honor for her to see her in person. The young lady said that the deep blue glow, like the glitter of the waves, as described to her, seemed very strange. But when she saw it with her own eyes, she understood everything. She was struck by the beauty. The young lady froze in place as she realized she was angry, knowing nothing about the young man. She began to quickly scan him. She was shocked because he just wore such an indecently rich ornament. She thought that he must have a very high status to be allowed into the closed auction. She saw his handsome face. She noticed his slightly casual manner of speech, but still it was noble. She came closer to him and, taking his hand, asked if he wanted to marry her. Psyche froze in shock as she did not expect to hear such a thing. Psyche looked at the young lady and asked her to let go. The young lady smiled and said that she would be good. A moment later, the Duke smiled as he looked at the young people, for Psyche had told him that she would go out for some air. He said that he ended up cheating on him in such a place. He looked at them with a grin, as the spectacle was interesting. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise, as she did not expect to see him in such a place. The Duke looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she had better stop there. He smiled and said that the man she had just proposed to was already engaged. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The young lady was taken aback and decided to leave them in a hurry. She shouted that the young man should have told her about this in advance. She asked him to pretend that it had not happened and wished him happiness in love. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise and said that she had to return something to him. A moment later, she handed him an earring. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she suddenly decided to return it. He asked if they hadn't already closed this topic. Psyche was taken aback, looking at the Duke. She said that she did not know that it was a tear of the waves. She said that it was too precious a gift. She said that she had just learned about it from the young lady. Psyche froze in place as she realized that he had given her a gift without even knowing what it was. The Duke was taken aback as he realized that he had not thoroughly studied the information in the report. He looked at the young lady intently and said that it was too late since the gift had been given. He said that she could just keep it, since no one but her could use the item. The young lady looked at him in surprise and said that there had to be a way to fix this, since she couldn't just accept such an expensive gift. The Duke smiled as he looked at the young lady and said that she simply had no other option. She looked at him and asked in what sense the Duke said that he bought this item to fight monsters. The Duke smiled as he looked at the young lady and said that in her hands, it really served its purpose. The young lady froze in shock as he had just touched her tenderly. She was confused as she did not know what she had felt. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said with a beaming smile that the jewelry really suited her. Some time later, the young lady came to the festival. She sighed heavily as it was very difficult for her to find the person she wanted. She thought for a moment that she should have waited for the Duke after all. She decided to throw the thoughts away, since she knew nothing except the name, and it would be better for her to find out everything herself. The young lady looked at the raven that was following her and said with a smile that she would step aside and he should carefully follow her. She thought that the search would be more difficult than she had expected. She had very little information, and she saw a lot of people around her. She thought that she should go somewhere she had not been before. Moments later, she heard a familiar voice. The lady looked at the young man with a smirk and said that she relied on him very much and he should know about it. Psyche was surprised. She didn't understand what her brother was doing next to Siona. She wondered if they knew each other, but still she knew that she had to leave quickly before they noticed her. She thought that her brother would be with her sister, as she knew that Lilia really wanted to attend the festival. The young lady in turn thought for a moment about what she saw as the situation was very strange. She had sorted out almost all the family affairs, and she didn't know her at all, she thought for a moment, because if you look at Lilia, who had been to the festival, she said something unusual, and that the dolls were amazing in themselves since they could move. She was interested in whether it was possible to control the dead with the help of magic. The young lady in turn knew that this was her first festival, so what she heard really surprised her. Sure. A moment later, she heard a voice and turned to see her knight. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect to see him. She looked at him closely and asked if he was okay, as she knew she needed to contact him. At least once the young man smiled and said that thanks to her, everything was fine for him, and the Duke took care of everything. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect to hear something like that. The young man smiled and said that everything was exactly like that. Only the Duke told him not to cross paths with the young lady anymore, but today they met by chance. He said that the Duke was of course testing him, but he also thought that there was something else here. The young lady looked at the young knight in bewilderment. She did not understand what he was talking about. He looked at her closely and asked if she had come to enjoy the festival. She thought for a moment and said that she had not. She wondered if she could tell him everything she thought, that she could just say that she was looking for a person. Psyche looked at the knight closely and said that she was looking for someone, namely, a mercenary named Delison. She said that she only knew that he was from the West. She knew that, unfortunately, she was not sure that she would be able to find him in the crowd of people herself. The young man looked at the young lady in surprise and thoughtfully said that he had heard that name somewhere. A moment later, he said that it was one of Stella's pseudonyms. She asked if this was the leader of the West and the mistress of the Silent Land. The young man smiled and said that everything was exactly like that, and he also came to see her. He was surprised, as it was a very interesting coincidence. The young lady wondered for a moment if it was a coincidence that they had come to the festival and were looking for the same person. But she was worried about the fact that the key to solving the problem of the North was with the leader of the West. He looked at her intently and said that if necessary, they could go together, and he would introduce her to Stella. He looked at her intently and asked if she had any other business. The young lady was a little taken aback, and thanking him for his concern, said that this would be enough. He looked at her intently and asked if she could listen to the end of what he was about to tell her, and perhaps it would confuse her. He looked closely at the young lady and said that he thought she was a victim of the Rias incident. The young lady thought for a moment, for she had heard something similar somewhere, and it was from the Duke. A moment later, the young people looked around as they heard a loud explosion. People screamed in fear and ran in different directions. They saw what was coming towards them. The young lady looked into the distance in surprise at everything that was happening. She did not understand what it was. The young people froze in place as they saw a large doll that was behaving very ominously. The young lady told the knight that she was evacuating people from the tent and he was to take them to safety. The knight rushed after the young lady and asked if they could do the opposite. Psyche said that if someone had difficulty moving, he would be more useful than her. The young lady looked at all the people who were near her and shouted for them to move aside. She said that if they saw guards along the way, they needed to explain the situation. A moment later, she froze in place as she felt the ominous presence of the doll behind her. But her friend still managed to save her. He looked at her closely and asked if she was okay. The young lady exhaled heavily and said that she was okay. And it was very wonderful that the dolls were clumsy. He looked at her intently and said that everyone had been saved. He asked if she had seen Stella among the evacuees. Psyche looked at the knight intently and, asking for forgiveness, said that unfortunately she had not seen her, and even if she had encountered her, she would hardly have recognized her. He said that the girl usually dresses in Western style, so she should immediately catch the eye. He said that if you think about it, she might go looking for the instigator of the confusion. The young lady said that one person could not handle such huge dolls, and if they were left in the center of the capital, the damage would increase. He looked at her closely and said that nothing suspicious was noticed during the evacuation, and probably Stella went to look for the culprits. The young lady said that if Stella was here, then they could work together, and if not, then they would figure it out themselves. He looked at her intently and said that he would go too. A moment later, the young lady saw her friend. Crow showed the young lady that she couldn't go alone, as it was very dangerous. She looked closely at her friend and said that she wouldn't fight them, she would just quietly scout out the situation. She looked at her friend intently and said that Stella might be here, and the Duke needed her help. The young lady looked at her friend intently and said that if he pulled out all her hair, the Duke would be displeased. The raven let go of the young lady with lightning speed. Some time later, they entered the hall and noticed that it was very quiet there. The young lady was surprised that there were no dolls in the room. The young man shouted and called for Stella, but unfortunately, no one answered. The young lady looked at her friend and asked if he could look around. The young man went to look further into the hall. He froze in place when he saw something very suspicious. He called the young lady to come to him. Approaching the knight, the young lady froze in place. They were surprised because they saw a large magic circle. The young man said that unfortunately it might not be noticeable from the outside. She looked at the circle in surprise and saw that it was slightly painted over. She asked if it had already been deactivated. The young man said that it seemed to be the circle that was the cause. He said that they needed to leave things as they were and contact the Magic Association. But a moment later, the young lady froze in place as she was enveloped in smoke. Isolette brought the Duke documents related to the Reyes case. The Duke looked at his assistant and told him to leave the documents, and he would look at them later. He looked closely at the documents that contained information about Siona Tuberos. He learned that she was capable of plant magic, mind magic, and hallucinations. Leah looked at the Duke closely and said that the wavelengths were similar to the forbidden magic left at the scene of the monsters and what she had stumbled upon the next day of her investigation. Isolette looked at the Duke with a puzzled look and asked why he suddenly took up the reinvestigation of that incident. The Duke asked in surprise if there was really some problem. He said that, although it was not so clear-cut, the victim was the imperial family. Isolette looked at the Duke with bewilderment and said that even if he discovered something new, nothing would change since there were no direct descendants of Silkesia left. The Duke sighed heavily and said that not everything was so clear. The Duke said, looking at the young man, that the mouth of one of the 4 families that had existed for hundreds of years had mystically broken off, and the other was in great danger. The Duke looked at the young man closely and said that he was not entirely sure, but that he had no choice but to conduct this investigation, given that these were not just other people's problems. A moment later, the Duke froze in shock as he sensed emotions from the ring. The young man looked at the Duke in surprise, as he did not understand the change in his face. The Duke was furious and did not understand how this could have happened. He shouted in rage and called Crow. He did not understand how it could have happened that the connection with the lady was broken. The young lady, in turn, lay in pitch darkness and heard someone's voice. The girl looked at the young lady in surprise. She was puzzled and did not know what would happen now. Psyche, in turn, looked intently at the girl who was next to her. She wondered who was in front of her now. She did not understand why the child was next to her and wondered where she was. Psyche looked at the child next to her in surprise. You asked if he was Crow. Crow looked at the young lady in confusion and said that he was Psyche, had heard that the beast people hide from human pursuit deep in the eastern forests. She could not imagine that Crow was one of them. She looked at her friend closely and asked where they were. Crow said that unfortunately he didn't know. The young lady in turn was puzzled, since at first no energy emanated from the ring. She realized that this was an unusual space. She was puzzled since it was very dark, and nothing was visible at all. The young lady smiled and said that it was very good that she took it with her. Crow looked in surprise at the stone, which was very shiny. The young lady smiled and said that now they would be a little brighter. A moment later, they were cutting their way forward. Crow was surprised that the young lady was very strong. A moment later, her friend on her temple was on her back. The young lady sighed heavily and said that if he was hanging, then she would not be able to attack. She said that it would be better if he took the form of a crow and sat on her shoulder. He sighed heavily and said that he couldn't do that because he couldn't change shape. Here the young lady was a little surprised. She sighed heavily and said that he needed to stay out of the way and hold on tight. The young man looked at the young lady and asked why, if she was so strong, she got it last time. He said that Dad was very angry. The young lady asked in surprise which father he was talking about. He did not answer. The lady wondered if he was talking about the Duke. Now Psyche thought for a moment, as it was very strange for her to hear such a thing. She knew that the beast people on average live longer than people. A moment later, she froze in place as she sensed something ahead. The girl looked at them intently and told them not to go any further. The young lady looked at the girl and the children next to them. In surprise, she asked if her name was Stella. Stella looked at her in surprise and asked how she knew her name. The young lady said that she would explain everything later, but first they needed to get them out of here. A moment later, she cut through the iron bars with lightning speed. She looked closely at everyone present and asked if they were okay and not injured anywhere. Stella said that they were okay and also thanked them for their help. Stella sighed heavily and said that she tried to save herself, but she couldn't use any ability. She said that, in this place, everything is felt otherwise. Perhaps someone changed the coordinates. The young lady was shocked. She knew that Stella was from the west, and she was the mistress of the Silent Land. When she stood on the ground, nothing could hold back her mighty power. Psyche realized that this was truly an unusual place. The young lady looked closely at the crying children and asked who they were. Stella said that they were sucked in by the magic circle that was on the stage. The young lady sighed heavily and said that they couldn't stay here, and she would try to find another place. She looked at them closely and asked how they felt about it. Stella said that her powers were not effective here and asked if they could come with her. She said that she could not leave the children here. The young lady in turn agreed and told them to follow her. Crow looked at the young lady and asked if she could give the shiny thing to him so that he could show her the way. The young lady apologized to him and said that others would not see anything. Psyche said that even though the light was dim, the children were not so scared with it. She looked at him and said that when they got out of such a place, she would give him an even brighter one. The young man looked at her closely and said with a smile that it turned out that she was a very good person. He looked at her and asked with a smile if she wanted him to give her something nice. A moment later, he kissed her. Psyche froze in surprise on the spot. A moment later, they were transported to another place. The young lady was surprised. Crow asked with a smile if she liked it. Psyche noticed that the surroundings were glowing. He smiled looking at the young lady and said that it was his blessing. He asked if she liked it. The young lady knew that the blessing of the Beastman was a very interesting thing. The Beastmen shared their ability due to the deterioration of the relationship between werewolves and humans. Now few people are awarded the blessing. The young lady looked at her friend with confusion and asked why he gave it to her. Crow said that there was no one else. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked why he didn't give it to the Duke. Crow said that the Duke had forgotten about it first. The young lady in turn remembered that the Duke had another Beastman. She looked closely at her friend and with an embarrassed smile thanked him. She knew that no one had received such grace. For a long time, it made her very happy and excited. He looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if something had happened there. He said that they had been standing there for a long time. He sighed heavily, looking at the young lady, and said that the road had ended. Psyche was surprised, as she did not expect such a thing. The young lady looked at everyone present and said that they were stuck here, and it was impossible to go further. Stella looked at the young lady in surprise and asked how this could happen. Crow looked at the children in surprise and asked why they were crying. He was confused and didn't understand why it made them so upset. He looked at them intently and said that he had told them that the road had ended, not that they would not be going home. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise and asked if there was any way to go further. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she didn't know the right one. He said that his dad told him that if there was no answer, he could try to destroy everything. The young lady looked at him in surprise. A moment later, Crow ran off somewhere, and a few minutes later, a loud crack was heard. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise and shouted for him to come down as the walls were collapsing. Stella looked at the young lady and asked if that youngest was the Duke's. Looking at the lady, she asked if that youngest was the Duke's bride. The young lady looked at her intently and said that it was exactly like that. Stella came closer to her and sighed heavily and said that she must have suffered a lot with that child. Psyche froze in place, as she did not understand what was being discussed. Crow looked at the young lady and called her. He said with a smile that it would have been possible to destroy everything, and it would have been faster. The young lady looked in bewilderment at her friend, who was holding some man. Psyche did not understand where he came from. He asked what he should do and whether he should throw the man out. The young lady looked at her friend intently and said that he couldn't do that. Since they needed to find out how to get out of this place, she said that she would go up to him right away. The man looked intently at the young lady and asked her for mercy. She looked at him with fury and asked where the exit was. The man looked at her puzzled and said that he didn't know, and only he knew how to reverse the powers of the circle. The young lady looked at the man in surprise and asked who he was. The man looked at the young lady in surprise and asked who she was and what she was doing in a place like this. He said that the magic circle was only supposed to absorb small children. Psyche froze in place, as she now understood why it was created, but still wondered why they needed it. A moment later, she heard another man's voice. Turning around, she was very surprised. Because she saw a man in front of her, she realized that he was very dangerous. The man looked at the young lady closely and said with a smirk that she was a swordsman. The young lady froze in surprise and wondered if he knew her. A moment later, the man struck her with lightning speed. He was furious and kept shouting at her. He looked at the young lady in surprise and asked with fury how she managed to repel the attack. The young lady froze in place, as she did not understand what was happening to her. His attack style was familiar, and this made her very wary. The young lady looked sideways at her friend and told him to evacuate everyone. He screamed that he could not do this, as he had to protect her. She shouted furiously that this was protection, otherwise she would not be able to fight. The Duke looked at his friend with fury and asked if he hadn't found her yet. Leah looked at the Duke and said that it was ordinary magic, very basic. She said that someone deliberately removed the protective spell from the dome. The Duke said that it was the Imperial family. The Duke of Fury asked who else could have set their sights on such an important event in the very center of the capital. The young lady looked at his friend intently and told him to watch his language. Aiden bowed before the Duke and asked for forgiveness for the fact that, despite being there, he was unable to help the young lady. The Duke looked at the knight with fury but did not answer. The Duke looked at Croa and asked if he had a connection with Croa. He looked at the raven with a gray face and said that he needed to find the lady no matter what it took. The Duke was puzzled and wondered what this feeling was. He knew he couldn't lose her. The man screamed and attacked with fury. He didn't understand how she could repel his attacks. The young lady glared at him as he was acting too hostile. She knew his fighting style was similar to her family's skill, but it was more destructive and it was very dangerous. She saw that he wanted to deal her a crushing blow. Psyche, in turn, understood that it was very dangerous, and she could not cope. She knew that she needed to dodge as quickly as possible. After he struck, she noticed that he had broken through the magical defense. She saw that the magic circle was hidden behind the wall. A moment later, the man froze in place from pain. He was in shock and did not understand what had happened. The young lady noticed that the circle had collapsed, but still wondered how she could get out now. She knew that while her opponent was still recovering from the shock, she had a chance. Psyche understood that she had to do everything in her power. She knew she had to deal with him before he got up. A moment later, she felt a rush of energy and froze in shock. Psyche was in shock and wondered if her body had shrunk. She didn't understand what was happening. She wondered in shock if there was another magician nearby. The man laughed as he looked at the young lady and asked if he was dreaming. He said with a grin that he would of course like her to crawl like insects, but he didn't think she would literally become one. A moment later, he struck her, but Psyche managed to turn away. She thought for a moment and realized that it was clearly not a matter of mood, and not a coincidence she knew that he clearly had some personal score to settle with her. She understood that in such a situation, all she could do was dodge the blows, but she understood perfectly well that even if that were the case, she would not last long. She didn't know what to do or how to be. Psyche wondered if she should try to get to the magic circle. She knew that unfortunately it was very far away. She froze in place as the man came close to her and prepared to strike. But the young lady in turn managed to dodge and hide. The man was furious, since he did not see her anywhere. Crow looked around in confusion and looked for the young lady. He didn't understand where she had gone. The young lady looked at her friend and called him. He sighed heavily as he was glad that he heard her. But still his surprise knew no bounds when he saw the young lady. She looked at her puzzled and asked what had happened to her. Psyche sighed heavily and said that she herself did not know how this had happened.